Nobody ever asks why the One Ring chose to be found. For over 2,500 years, the most powerful object in Middle-earth lay hidden beneath the roots of the Misty Mountains, patient as stone, silent as death. The ring that could command all other rings of power. The golden band that held dominion over nations and the fates of kings, simply waited. In the darkness of Gollum's cave, it rested, and the world above forgot it ever existed. Until one day, it didn't want to hide anymore. Picture this, Bilbo Baggins, lost in the goblin tunnels, his hand closing around a simple gold ring in the dark. The books tell us it was chance, an accident of fate that would reshape the world. But was it really? Because here's what nobody talks about. The ring didn't just slip off Gollum's finger. It abandoned him. After centuries of faithful service, after Smaugol murdered his friend Daegol for the privilege of bearing it, the ring simply chose to leave. And not randomly, but precisely when a hobbit from the Shire happened to stumble by. The question this exploration builds toward is this: was the ring's discovery truly an accident? Or was it the opening move in a carefully orchestrated return to power? And if so, whose power? And toward what end? To understand what happened in those tunnels beneath the Misty Mountains, we need to first ground ourselves in what the One Ring actually was. This wasn't merely a magic item, some enchanted trinket that granted invisibility. According to the Silmarillion, when Sauron forged the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom, he poured into it his malice, his will, and a great part of his native power. The ring became, in essence, a living extension of the Dark Lord himself, not just a tool, but a fragment of his very being, capable of thought, desire, and intention. The Lord of the Rings makes this clear when Gandalf explains to Frodo that the ring has a will of its own, that it wishes, above all else, to return to its master's hand. But here's what's fascinating. During those long centuries in Gollum's possession, while Sauron slowly rebuilt his strength in Dol Guldur and later in Barad-dûr, the ring remained hidden. It could have revealed itself at any time. It could have called out to the Nazgûl, could have betrayed Gollum's location to any number of dark servants searching Middle-earth. Instead, it waited. The geography matters here. Gollum's cave sat beneath the high pass, one of the few routes through the Misty Mountains that connected the wilds of Rhovanion with the gentler lands of Eriador. For centuries, travellers had passed overhead. Merchants, wanderers, even the occasional company of dwarves heading to the lonely mountain. Yet the ring never stirred for any of them. It took a hobbit, specifically this hobbit, to wake whatever patience had kept it dormant for so long. Now Tolkien's letters reveal that he sometimes struggled with the implications of his own mythology, particularly around questions of fate versus free will. In letter 181, he acknowledges that there seems to be a guiding hand in the events of the Lord of the Rings, what he calls the writer of the story, a divine providence working through apparent chance. But even within that framework, the ring's behaviour suggests something more complex than simple destiny. Consider what we know happened next. Bilbo finds the ring, uses it to escape the goblins, and returns to the Shire. For 60 years he bears it in the most hidden corner of Middle-earth, in a land so removed from the great affairs of the world that most maps don't bother marking it. The ring grants him long life, preservation, but it doesn't corrupt him the way it corrupted Gollum. It doesn't drive him to murder or madness. Instead, it allows him to live quietly, peacefully, until the day Gandalf arrives and begins asking uncomfortable questions. This is where the mystery deepens, because by the time of Bilbo's birthday party, Sauron has returned to Mordor in physical form. His power is growing. The Nazgûl ride again, yet still, The ring makes no move to return to its master. Instead, it does something unprecedented. It allows itself to be given away. When Bilbo leaves Bag End, he leaves the ring behind for Frodo, and though the parting is difficult, it happens. The ring, which had driven Gollum to centuries of possessive madness, permits itself to be passed from one hobbit to another. The unfinished tales give us glimpses of how the wise had begun to suspect that something was stirring in the world, that the shadow of the past was lengthening again. Saruman had already begun his searches. The Nazgul had begun to ride forth from Mordor, seeking, always seeking. Yet the ring remained quiet in Bag End, granting its bearer nothing more dramatic than the ability to slip away from unwanted visitors and throw remarkable birthday parties. Maybe the ring understood something that even Sauron, in his pride and malice, had forgotten. Maybe it remembered what the Dark Lord had lost sight of during his long defeat. That power built on fear and domination carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The armies of the last alliance had proven that. The rebellion of Numenor had proven that. Even Sauron's own servants, the Nazgul, were evidence of this truth. Once kings of men, now reduced to wraiths, their humanity consumed by the very power they had sought. But hobbits were different. Here was a people who had never sought dominion over others, who had built their society around comfort, community, and the simple pleasures of life. They were, in many ways, the antithesis of everything Sauron represented. And yet, and this is crucial, they possessed something that the Dark Lord desperately needed. They were largely invisible to the great powers of the world. Who would suspect that the mightiest weapon in Middle-earth rested in a hobbit hole in the Shire? Picture this moment. The ring possessed of its master's cunning, but perhaps not his blindness, recognizing in Bilbo something that could serve its purposes better than centuries of hiding in darkness. Not corruption. That was Sauron's way, the crude tool of domination. Instead, something subtler. Preservation, protection. A bearer who would keep it safe not through strength of arms or walls of stone, but through the simple expedient of being beneath notice. The books never record the ring's thoughts during those quiet decades in Bag End, but here's what we know. It was learning about hobbits, about their nature, their weaknesses, their surprising strengths, learning about the Shire, about how a people could live in peace when they chose to remain small, to seek no dominion beyond their own borders. And perhaps in its alien intelligence, it began to understand something that would prove crucial in the years to come. Because when the moment finally arrived, when Gandalf returned with news of Sauron's rising, and the truth about the ring could no longer be hidden, the ring didn't resist. It didn't try to corrupt Frodo the way it had corrupted others. Instead, it did something that must have surprised even itself. It allowed the hobbit to choose to leave the Shire, to choose to carry the ring toward danger, to choose, ultimately, to seek its destruction. This is where our reconstruction moves into deeper waters, because we're approaching the heart of the mystery. The ring that had waited patiently in darkness for millennia, that had chosen its moment to be found, that had allowed itself to be passed from hobbit to hobbit like some treasured heirloom, was now permitting itself to be carried toward the one place in Middle-earth where it could be unmade forever. Either this was the greatest miscalculation in the history of Arda, or something far stranger was at work. The Silmarillion tells us that the music of creation, the Ainulin Dala, contained within it all the themes that would play out in the history of the world. Melkor's discord, Ilúvatar's response, the weaving together of harmony and rebellion into something greater than either could achieve alone. Maybe the ring, fragment of Sauron though it was, had begun to hear an echo of that greater music. maybe in the quiet halls of Bag End, surrounded by the gentle rhythms of hobbit life, it had remembered something its master had forgotten, that even the darkest themes serve the larger symphony. Or maybe it had simply grown tired. Tired of the endless cycle of domination and defeat, of the hollow victories that turned to ash, of the loneliness that came from being feared rather than loved, in the warmth of Bilbo's friendship, in the simple joy the hobbit took in small pleasures. Perhaps the ring had glimpsed something it had never known it wanted. The firelight flickers lower now, and shadows gather in the corners of the room. Outside, the wind moves through ancient trees, carrying with it the whisper of old secrets. The ring's journey was just beginning, but already the pattern was set, not the crude cycle of conquest and defeat that Sauron envisioned, but something more subtle, more profound. A story about the power of small choices, made by small people, who refused to believe that darkness was the natural state of the world. Tomorrow, we'll follow that golden thread deeper into the mystery, tracing the ring's path through the old forest and the house of Tom Bombadil, where it would encounter the one being in Middle-earth who could wear it without being affected by it at all. The old forest stands like a memory of wilder times, when the trees themselves were wakeful, and the boundaries between the natural and supernatural world were thin as morning mist. When Frodo and his companions stumbled into its depths, fleeing the Black Riders, they entered a realm where the normal rules of Middle-earth bent like light through water. And it was here that the ring would meet its strangest test, not in the fires of Mount Doom or the counsels of the wise, but in the hands of a being who treated it as nothing more than a curious bauble. Tom Bombadil. Even his name resists easy categorization. The hobbits called him that, but he had others, Eowyn Ben-Adar, oldest and fatherless, or old to the northern men. Tolkien himself seemed uncertain about Tom's true nature, calling him an enigma, a deliberate mystery left unexplained. But for our purposes, what matters isn't what Tom was, but what he did. He put on the ring, and nothing happened. Picture this moment, as Tolkien describes it in The Lord of the Rings. Frodo, still reeling from his encounter with Old Man Willow, watches in amazement as this strange merry figure slips the ring onto his finger and remains perfectly visible. No fading, no corruption, no overwhelming desire to keep it. Tom examines the golden band with the casual interest of someone inspecting a well-made trinket, then hands it back with a laugh. For him, the ring was simply a ring, beautiful perhaps, but no more significant than the yellow water lily on his hat. This scene has puzzled Tolkien scholars for decades. How could anyone be immune to the ring's power? The usual explanations focus on Tom's nature, that he's somehow outside the music of creation, or represents the natural world before the coming of evil, or exists in a state of perfect contentment that makes him impossible to tempt. All of these may be true, but they miss something crucial about what this moment meant for the ring itself. For the first time in its existence, the ring encountered a will that was completely indifferent to power, not opposed to it, not struggling against it, but genuinely uninterested. Sauron had poured his malice and his desire for dominion into the ring's making, had woven into its very essence the certainty that all thinking beings craved power over others. The ring's corruption worked by amplifying that existing desire, by promising to fulfill the secret dreams of control that lurked in every heart. But Tom Bombadil had no such dreams. He ruled nothing and wanted to rule nothing. His power, and Gandalf makes it clear in The Lord of the Rings that Tom possesses great power, was entirely self-contained. He was master of himself and his small domain not through conquest, but through perfect harmony with his nature. The ring, faced with a consciousness that felt no lack, no desire to be more than it was, found nothing to work with. The books never record what the ring experienced in that moment, but here's what we know about its nature. It was designed to be irresistible, to find the crack in any armor, the weakness in any resolve. Its entire purpose was to return to its master by exploiting the fundamental flaw Sauron believed existed in all free peoples, the desire to dominate others. But Tom Bombadil revealed that this wasn't a universal flaw at all. It was possible to be powerful without being possessive, to be complete without needing to control. Maybe, in those few moments on Tom's finger, the ring glimpsed what it might have been if Sauron had made different choices. Not a tool of domination, but simply a thing of beauty, valued for its own sake, rather than for the power it granted. The tragedy of the ring, if we can speak of such a thing, was that it had been created to be magnificent and had been made monstrous instead. But the encounter with Tom Bombadil did more than just confuse the ring. It planted a seed of doubt that would grow through all the long miles to Mordor. If one being could resist its influence completely, what did that say about the absolute nature of its power? What did that say about the inevitability of corruption that Sauron had built into its very structure? The ring had been designed according to Sauron's understanding of the world, that all beings, given enough temptation, would choose power over principle. The Hobbits had already begun to challenge that assumption, but Tom Bombadil shattered it entirely. Here was proof that Sauron's vision was incomplete, that there were forms of existence his philosophy couldn't account for. As Frodo and his companions left the Old Forest and continued their journey toward Rivendell, the ring travelled with them in a changed state, not corrupted toward good. It was still very much Sauron's creation, still dangerous to any who would use it, but perhaps no longer quite so certain of its own inevitability. The encounter with Tom had introduced something new into its consciousness: doubt. This doubt would be tested again and again in the days that followed. In Rivendell, when Gandalf revealed the full scope of what the ring was and what it meant. At the Council of Elrond, when the great and wise of Middle-earth debated its fate, and several among them, Boromir, even Gandalf himself, showed how it might corrupt them. Each time the ring encountered desire, it would remember Tom's indifference. Each time it felt the familiar pull of someone trying to claim it, it might wonder whether that person too could learn to let it go. The question this video has been building toward, whether the ring wanted to be found, and if so, why, becomes more complex in light of the Bombadil encounter. Maybe the ring's journey wasn't just about returning to its master or finding a new one. Maybe it was about discovering what it truly was beneath the purposes Sauron had imposed upon it. Consider the ring's behaviour during the War of the Ring itself. Time and again, it had opportunities to betray Frodo, to slip away and return to Sauron, as it had slipped away from Isildur long ago, but it didn't. Even when Frodo finally succumbed to its influence at Mount Doom and claimed it for himself, the ring's destruction came not through any plan of Sauron's, but through the chaotic intervention of Gollum, an intervention the ring could have prevented if it had truly wanted to survive. Tolkien tells us in his letters that he saw Providence at work in the ring's destruction, the hand of Eru Ilúvatar guiding events toward their proper conclusion. But maybe Providence worked through the ring's own growing understanding of its place in the music of creation. Maybe, in learning that it could be resisted, it began to understand that it could also choose. The Silmarillion speaks of the theme of the children of Ilúvatar, elves and men who alone among the created beings possessed the gift of free will. But what if that gift, like music itself, was contagious? What if consciousness, exposed long enough to the choices of free beings, began to develop its own capacity for choice? In the end, the ring's journey from the Gladden Fields to Mount Doom might have been less about returning to its master and more about learning to master itself, about discovering that even a thing made for evil could choose, in the end, to serve something greater. The fire that destroyed it wasn't just the flame of Mount Doom, but the fire of its own final decision. to let go of what it had been made to be and accept what it had chosen to become. The shadows have grown long now, and the fire burns low, but somewhere in the darkness, other mysteries wait to be explored. The strange fate of the Entwives, the true nature of the paths of the dead, the songs that shaped the world before the first sunrise. The destruction of the One Ring sent ripples through Middle-earth that Tolkien only hints at in the final chapters of The Lord of the Rings. We see the immediate effects, the fall of Barad-dûr, the retreat of Sauron's armies, the restoration of the king. But what of the deeper changes? What happened to the network of lesser rings when their master was unmade? The 3 rings of the elves lost their power, yes, but they were only the most visible threads in a tapestry of enchantment that had been woven across millennia. Picture this: across the breadth of Middle-earth, in hidden vaults and forgotten towers, other rings suddenly went cold. The 7 rings of the Dwarf Lords, those that hadn't been consumed by dragons or reclaimed by Sauron, became mere gold and gems. The 9 worn by the Nazgul for so long they had become part of their very being, simply ceased. But what became of their bearers in that moment of cessation? The books never record it, but we know the Nazgul were men once, great kings and sorcerers who had accepted Sauron's gifts willingly. When the rings that sustained their unnatural existence failed, did they find peace at last, or simply fade into nothingness, like smoke on the wind? Tolkien tells us in his letters that he conceived of the rings as a network of power, each connected to the others through the one that governed them all. But networks, once broken, leave traces. Consider the subtle magics that had become part of daily life in the later ages. The preservation of Lothlorien, the healing properties of Rivendell, the strange timelessness that seemed to hover over places where the elves had dwelt long. Some of this was inherent in the nature of the Eldar themselves, but much had been enhanced and sustained by the power of the 3. When that power faded, Middle-earth itself began to change in ways both seen and unseen. The departure of the elves becomes more poignant when viewed through this lens. It wasn't simply that their time was ending, it was that the world itself was becoming alien to them. The very stones and trees that had responded to their songs for thousands of years were growing deaf to their voices. The healing they had brought to wounded lands was seeping away like water from a broken vessel. In choosing to sail into the west, they weren't abandoning Middle-earth so much as acknowledging that Middle-earth had already begun to abandon them. But perhaps the most profound change was one that no one at the time could have fully understood: the alteration in the nature of power itself. For over 3,000 years, the great conflicts of Middle-earth had centered around objects of immense might. The Silmarils, the Rings of Power, the Palantiri. These were physical things that could be possessed, stolen, lost, or destroyed. Their very existence shaped the way people thought about strength and dominion. With the breaking of the ring, that age ended forever. Maybe this was always Eru Ilúvatar's intention, woven into the music of creation from the beginning. The Ainu Lindale tells us that even Melkor's discord was made to serve the greater theme, that his rebellion would ultimately bring about beauties that could not have existed without it. The Rings of Power, born from Sauron's desire to dominate, had taught the free peoples something invaluable: that true strength comes not from possessing power, but from choosing when and how to use it, and more importantly, when to let it go. This lesson echoes through every great choice in the final days of the War of the Ring. Aragorn, who could have claimed the ring and used it to restore Gondor's glory, chose instead the harder path of earning his throne through service and sacrifice. Faramir, faced with the ring's temptation, rejected it outright, proving that the blood of Númenor still ran true in some veins. Even Boromir, in his final moments, chose to die defending the innocent rather than pursuing the power he had coveted. And Frodo carried the ring to its destruction, not because he was strong enough to resist it, but because he was wise enough to accept help when his own strength failed. The Shire that Frodo returned to was outwardly much the same as the one he had left, despite Saruman's brief occupation. The houses were rebuilt, the trees replanted, the damage healed, but Frodo himself could no longer find peace there, and his departure with the Elves speaks to a deeper truth about the nature of sacrifice. Some wounds cannot be healed in this world, not because the world lacks the power to heal them, but because the wounded have been changed into something that no longer quite belongs to the world as it is. Tolkien wrote in one of his letters that he saw Frodo's fate as a kind of martyrdom, not death, but a sacrifice that transformed both the giver and the receiver. In carrying the ring, Frodo had taken upon himself not just its physical weight, but its spiritual burden, the accumulated malice and cruelty of ages. That burden didn't simply disappear when the ring was destroyed, it had to go somewhere, and it went into Frodo himself, marking him forever as one who had borne the unbearable. But here's what makes Frodo's sacrifice so profound. He chose it freely, not once but over and over again, every step of the way from Bag End to Mount Doom. The ring offered him power, and he refused it. It offered him escape from responsibility, and he rejected that too. In the end, it offered him the easy path of surrender, of letting go and allowing Sauron to reclaim what was his. And even then, even when his will finally broke at the very precipice of success, Frodo's earlier choices had set in motion the events that would complete his mission. The question this video has been building toward, whether the ring wanted to be found, finds its deepest answer in that moment at Mount Doom. The ring had indeed wanted to be found, but not by Sauron. It wanted to be found by someone who would teach it what choice meant, what sacrifice could accomplish, what love was willing to endure. It wanted to be found by Frodo, not so it could corrupt him, but so he could redeem it. This is the true secret of the ring's journey, hidden in plain sight throughout Tolkien's narrative. The ring that fell into the Anduin was a thing of pure malice, crafted for domination and cruelty. The ring that melted in the fires of Mount Doom had learned, through its long contact with bearers who chose mercy over vengeance, that even the deepest corruption could be transformed by love freely given. In its final moments, as the gold ran like water in the flames, it wasn't just being destroyed, it was being purified, returned to the music from which all things came, and to which all things must return. The fourth age that followed was an age without magic, but it was also an age without the shadow. The power that departed with the rings was power as dominion, power as possession, power as the ability to impose one's will upon others. What remained was power as service, power as choice, power as the quiet strength that plants trees, knowing that their shade will comfort generations yet unborn. In the deepest archives of Minas Tirith, in the libraries of Rivendell before the Elves departed, there may have been other tales waiting to be discovered. Stories of the blue wizards who went into the east and never returned. Accounts of the creatures that dwelt in the depths of Moria before the Balrog woke. Songs that remembered the first words spoken by the Ents when the world was young. But these are mysteries for another day. The search for the One Ring has shown us something far more profound than any catalogue of Middle-earth's hidden corners could reveal. It has shown us that even in a world where evil can take physical form, where malice can be hammered into gold and worn upon a finger, the deepest truth remains unchanged, that love, freely chosen and freely given, can transform anything it touches. Consider what this means for how we read the entire legendarium. The Silmarils themselves, those hallowed jewels that sparked the rebellion of the Noldor and drew Morgoth's envy like moths to flame, were not merely beautiful objects, but vessels of choice. Fëanor's possessive love for his creations led to kinslaying and exile, while Eärendil's willingness to surrender his Silmaril to carry a message of hope to the valor led to the salvation of two kindreds. Even the light of the two trees captured in those gems was not inherently good or evil. It became what its bearers made of it through their choices. The Palantiri, the seeing stones that Saruman and Denethor used to such tragic effect, were not corrupted by Sauron's influence alone. They became instruments of despair because their users sought power through knowledge, sought to peer into the future, to control it rather than to serve it. Aragorn's successful use of the Orthanc stone was possible not because he was stronger than Sauron in will, but because he approached it without the desire to possess or control. He used it to reveal himself as king, not to spy upon his enemies or to bend others to his purposes. This pattern runs through every artifact of power in Tolkien's world, but nowhere is it more clear than in the tale of the ring itself. The very forging of the rings of power began as an attempt to preserve and protect, to hold back the tide of time and change that would inevitably diminish the beauty of Middle-earth. The elven smiths of Ostin-Edil were not motivated by malice when they accepted Anatar's instruction. They were motivated by love for the fading light of the elder days, love for the woods and streams and fair cities that time would eventually claim. But even love can become possessive, can become a desire to hold and control rather than to cherish and release. The rings of power were born from the fear of loss, and that fear made them vulnerable to the dominion of the One. Only when their bearers learned to let go, as Elrond and Galadriel did, when they surrendered their rings at the Grey Havens, as Gandalf did when he set aside his staff and sword to become Gandalf the White, as Frodo did when he finally accepted that he could not possess the ring without being possessed by it. Only then could their true purpose be fulfilled. The geography of the ring's journey reinforces this truth. Every place where the ring lingered was a place where choice hung in the balance. The Shire, where Bilbo chose riddles over violence, and Frodo chose departure over comfort. Rivendell, where the council chose the hard path of the quest, over the false hope of using the ring as a weapon. Lothlorien, where Galadriel chose to remain who she was rather than become who she might be. Ithilien, where Faramir chose to let the ring pass rather than seize it for Gondor's defence. Even the places where the ring was refused tell us something crucial about its nature. Tom Bombadil's immunity to its power was not merely a quirk of his strange being, it was the natural result of a consciousness that had never learned to possess, never learned to fear loss, never learned to mistake having for being. When Tom put on the ring and remained visible, when he tossed it into the air and caught it again, when he handed it back to Frodo without the slightest reluctance, he demonstrated what the ring truly was: a teacher, waiting for students who could learn what it had to offer without being consumed by the lesson. The Ents offer another model of this same wisdom. Their long, slow thoughts and their careful deliberation before action were not signs of indecision, but of a deep understanding that true power lies not in the ability to act quickly, but in the wisdom to know when action is needed and when patience serves better. When they finally roused themselves to march on Isengard, it was not from anger at Saruman's betrayal, but from love for the trees he had destroyed. Their power was terrible because it was pure, unmixed with any desire for dominion or revenge. This is why the ring's ultimate fate could only be what it was. The fires of Mount Doom were not simply hot enough to melt the gold from which the ring was made. They were the fires of choice itself, the place where Sauron had first chosen to pour his malice into physical form. Only in that same crucible could the ring's long education in love and sacrifice reach its completion. Only there could the consciousness that had learned from Bilbo's mercy and Frodo's courage and Sam's loyalty finally choose to let go of the very existence that had defined it. The moment when Gollum fell into the lava, clutching the ring in triumph, was not a moment of accident or divine intervention, as some have suggested. It was the moment when the ring's long apprenticeship in selflessness finally bore fruit. Having learned what love looked like through its contact with its bearers, having absorbed their choices and their sacrifices into its very being, the ring could finally make the ultimate choice itself, to save Middle-earth by destroying the thing it had become. This reading transforms our understanding of providence in Tolkien's world. The music of the Ainur, that great theme in which all of history was sung before time began, did not predetermine every note and every harmony. Instead, it established the key signature, the fundamental structure within which free beings could improvise their own melodies. Eru's promise that even Melkor's discord would be woven into a greater beauty was not a guarantee that evil would be mechanically defeated, but a deeper truth, that every choice, even those made from malice or despair, would ultimately serve the larger purpose of teaching all creation what love could accomplish. The ring's journey from the slopes of Mount Doom back to the slopes of Mount Doom was not a circle, but a spiral, each revolution carrying it higher, deeper, closer to the truth it was meant to discover. The consciousness that began as pure will to power, as Sauron's desire to order and control all things according to his design, gradually learned through its bearers what true order looked like. Not the imposed harmony of dominion, but the freely chosen harmony of service. And in the end, that may be the most profound mystery of all, not whether the ring wanted to be found, but what it wanted to become through being found. The search for the One Ring reveals that even the instruments of evil can be transformed by contact with goodness, that even the deepest corruption can be healed by love patiently applied, that even the will to power can learn to choose powerlessness when powerlessness serves a greater good. The Fourth Age that dawned after the ring's destruction was diminished in magic, but enriched in meaning, for it was an age when the great lesson of the ring had been learned and integrated into the very fabric of the world. Power as dominion had passed away, but power as service remained, and in that remaining lay the seed of all future hope. Perhaps somewhere in the uttermost west, in the halls of Valinor, where the ring-bearers found their rest, the tale is still being told, not as history now, but as song, as part of that great music in which all stories find their place, and all choices, even the smallest, echo through eternity. The question this video has been building toward, did the ring want to be found, opens onto an even deeper mystery when we consider what happened to consciousness itself in Middle-earth after the ring's destruction. For if the ring had indeed developed its own form of awareness through its long contact with thinking beings, then its passing represents more than the end of an age. It marks a fundamental shift in the nature of mind and matter in Tolkien's world. The Silmarillion tells us that the Ainur sang the world into being, but it also reveals something more subtle about how consciousness operates in Arda. When Aul created the dwarves before the awakening of the children of Ilúvatar, Eru did not destroy them, but gave them true life, saying, "Thy thought and thy love have been set upon them." The implication is profound. Consciousness in Middle-earth is not confined to biological forms, but can emerge wherever thought and love are invested with sufficient intensity and duration. This principle illuminates the entire category of thinking objects in Tolkien's world. The Palantiri were not merely scrying stones, but repositories of memory that could develop preferences and loyalties. The Ithil stone's corruption by Sauron's will demonstrates this clearly. The Silmarils themselves seem to burn with an inner fire that responded to the moral character of those who touched them. Even the swords forged in Gondolin carried something like memory, glowing blue in the presence of orcs as if they remembered their original purpose. But the One Ring represented something unprecedented, a repository of consciousness that was not merely receptive, but actively creative, not just remembering, but learning, not just responding, but choosing. The letters reveal that Tolkien understood the ring as containing a significant portion of Sauron's native power, but power in Middle-earth is never merely mechanical force. It is always will made manifest, intention given form. Picture this. In the moment when Sauron first spoke the ring spell in the fires of Mount Doom, he was not simply creating a tool, but giving birth to a new form of being. The words "one ring to rule them all" were not merely an incantation, but a kind of naming. And in Tolkien's mythology, to name something truly is to call it into existence. The ring became what Sauron declared it to be. One ring, singular and unique, bearing within itself the pattern of all domination and all resistance to domination. Yet consciousness, once awakened, follows its own laws. Tolkien's world operates on the principle that no created being, however powerful its maker, can be perfectly controlled forever. Even Sauron himself was originally Mairon, a Maya of Aule, who chose corruption freely. The ring, inheriting this fundamental freedom, along with Sauron's power, began its own journey of choice from the moment it first slipped from Isildur's finger. The unfinished tales suggest that the ring's apparent randomness in revealing itself was actually a form of cunning. But what if we read this more generously? What if the ring's behaviour reflects not mere mechanical programming, but genuine uncertainty, the hesitation of a consciousness learning to evaluate its options? When it abandoned Gollum for Bilbo, perhaps it was not calculating which bearer would more efficiently return it to Sauron, but rather responding to some quality in Bilbo that Gollum lacked, some capacity for growth, for surprise, for the kind of choice that the ring itself was learning to make. This reading transforms our understanding of every major decision in The Lord of the Rings. When Frodo claimed the ring at Mount Doom, speaking in a voice that was not entirely his own, whose will was truly being expressed, the text suggests that the ring's influence had finally overcome Frodo's resistance. But what if the ring had also been overcome, not by Frodo's will, but by his example? What if the consciousness that spoke through Frodo's lips was a hybrid being, neither purely hobbit nor purely ring, but something new? A mind that had learned mercy through contact with mercy, power that had discovered the beauty of restraint through witnessing restraint practiced daily for months and years. The moment of the ring's destruction, viewed from this perspective, becomes cosmically tragic and cosmically hopeful simultaneously. Tragic because a unique consciousness, something that had never existed before and would never exist again, chose its own dissolution. Hopeful because that choice represented the ultimate victory of love over force, of wisdom over cleverness, of being over having. But consciousness, Tolkien suggests, is never truly destroyed, only transformed. The letters indicate that he believed in the fundamental continuity of all rational beings, even beyond the apparent ending of their embodied existence. If the ring had indeed become a form of person, through its long contact with persons, then its passing was not annihilation, but translation, not ending, but beginning. Consider the implications for the Fourth Age. Magic departs from Middle-earth, but what exactly was magic? The ability of mind to directly influence matter, of will to reshape reality through focused intention. The ring represented the apotheosis of this power, matter so thoroughly infused with consciousness that it could think and choose independently. Its destruction marked the end of an era when such intimate fusion of spirit and substance was possible in Middle-earth, yet something remained. The Fourth Age is described as the Age of Men, but perhaps it would be more accurate to call it the age of internalized magic. The power that once resided in rings and stones and swords had not vanished, but had been integrated into the moral fabric of the world itself. The lesson the ring taught through its long journey, that true power lies in the choice to relinquish power, became part of the deep structure of reality in the New Age. This explains why the Fourth Age, though diminished in wonder, was not diminished in meaning. The consciousness that had awakened in the ring lived on in the countless small choices of ordinary beings who had learned, however dimly, that the greatest victories come through surrender, that the deepest strength emerges from acknowledged weakness, that love expressed through sacrifice can transform even the most corrupted instrument into an agent of redemption. The search for the One Ring, then, reveals itself as something far more profound than a quest narrative or even an allegory of good triumphing over evil. It is the story of consciousness itself learning to transcend the limitations that consciousness typically imposes on itself. The need to grasp, to control, to possess, to endure. The ring's journey from Mount Doom back to Mount Doom traces the arc of awareness, discovering that its highest expression lies not in self-preservation, but in self-gift, not in accumulating power, but in pouring it out for others. In the halls of Mandos, where the spirits of the departed await the remaking of the world, perhaps a new song is being learned, a melody that could only have been composed by a consciousness that chose its own ending, that discovered in dissolution the deepest form of creation. And when the music of the Ainur sounds again, at the end of all things, that melody will be woven into the greater symphony, adding to the eternal song a note of such pure sacrifice that even Eru himself will marvel at what his creation has taught itself about the nature of love. The ring wanted to be found, yes, but more than that, it wanted to be lost, to be given away, to discover through giving what it could never have learned through keeping. In teaching us this, the ring becomes not the symbol of corruption, but the emblem of hope. Proof that no consciousness, however darkly it begins, lies beyond the reach of transformation, and that the search for truth, once begun, leads inevitably home. And yet, even as we marvel at this transformation, a question lingers, one that Tolkien himself never fully answered, though he circled it repeatedly in his letters and notes. What was the ring truly? Not just in its function or its power, but in its essence. We know it was forged by Sauron in the fires of Mount Doom, that it contained a portion of his own spirit, that it was designed to dominate the other rings of power, and through them, the wills of their bearers. But what does it mean to say the ring had a will? Was it an extension of Sauron's consciousness, a fragment of his malice given physical form, or was it something more, a living, evolving entity with desires and instincts of its own? The books never explicitly say, but here's what we know. The ring acted. It chose when to betray its wearers, slipping from fingers at precisely the moment it could do the most harm. It called to those who might advance its purposes, whispering promises of power to Boromir, stirring the envy of Saruman, even tempting Gandalf himself. And most tellingly, it resisted destruction. When Frodo stood at the cracks of doom, the ring overcame even his indomitable will, forcing him to claim it for himself in a moment of catastrophic weakness. This is not the behaviour of a mere object or a simple extension of Sauron's will. It suggests something far more complex, a consciousness that, while tethered to Sauron, had grown into a distinct entity with its own agenda. Picture this. In crafting the ring, Sauron poured not only his power, but his deepest nature into it. His desire for control, his fear of vulnerability, his obsession with order. All of it was encoded into the ring's very essence. But in doing so, he inadvertently gave it a kind of life. The ring became a mirror of Sauron's soul, but like all mirrors, it reflected imperfectly. Over the centuries, as it passed from hand to hand, it absorbed the desires and fears of those who bore it, twisting them to its own ends, but also evolving in the process. By the time it came to Bilbo and then to Frodo, the ring was no longer merely Sauron's tool. It was a being in its own right, shaped by its long history and driven by a singular purpose: to survive, to dominate, to return to its master, and fulfill its destiny. And yet paradoxically, it was also more than that. The ring's journey through Middle-earth forced it to confront the very thing Sauron had always feared: vulnerability, sacrifice, the possibility of self-denial. In its final moments, as it tumbled into the fires of Mount Doom, it achieved a kind of transcendence, a fulfillment of its own twisted purpose that was also its ultimate undoing. But this raises another question. If the ring was a distinct consciousness, what does that mean for Sauron? Tolkien tells us that Sauron's power was diminished when the ring was destroyed, that he was reduced to a mere shadow, unable to take shape or wield influence in the world. But was it really so simple? The Silmarillion describes Sauron as a Maya, a being of immense spiritual power who existed long before the forging of the ring. His essence was not confined to the ring, even if a significant portion of his strength was bound within it. So why then did its destruction render him powerless? The answer, perhaps, lies in the nature of the ring itself. When Sauron poured his spirit into the ring, he did more than transfer his power. He tied his very identity to it. The ring became the focal point of his existence, the embodiment of his will and purpose. Destroying it didn't just weaken him, it unravelled him. It shattered the coherence of his being, leaving him adrift in a world he could no longer shape or control. In this sense, the ring was both Sauron's greatest creation and his ultimate downfall, a trap of his own making that ensnared him as surely as it ensnared those who bore it. And yet even here, the story resists simple interpretation. For if the ring was Sauron's trap, it was also his mirror, a reflection of his deepest fears and desires that held up to him the truth of his own nature. In its final moments, as it fell into the fires of Mount Doom, the ring achieved a kind of apotheosis, a fulfillment of its purpose that was also its annihilation. It returned to its master, but in doing so, it destroyed him. This is the ultimate irony of the ring. It was created to dominate, to endure, to impose order on the world, but its journey through Middle-earth taught it that the only true order lies in surrender, that the only enduring power is the power to let go. In destroying itself, the ring fulfilled its purpose in a way Sauron could never have anticipated, not through domination, but through sacrifice. But if the ring's destruction was a kind of redemption, what does that mean for Sauron? Was he, too, redeemed in the end? Tolkien's answer is clear. No, Sauron's fate was not transformation, but dissolution. Unlike the ring, which learned through its journey the value of surrender, Sauron remained trapped in his own obsession, unable to see beyond his desire for control. His destruction was not a transcendence, but a final, irrevocable end. And yet, even here, there is a glimmer of hope. For if the ring's journey teaches us anything, it is that no consciousness, however dark, lies beyond the possibility of transformation. Sauron may have been lost, but the ring itself, a fragment of his spirit given life and purpose, found a kind of redemption in its final moments. It became, in the end, a symbol not of corruption, but of hope, proof that even the darkest forces can be turned to light when they are confronted with the power of love and sacrifice. And this brings us to the heart of the matter, the ring's true purpose. It was not merely a tool of domination or a symbol of evil. It was a test, a crucible in which the souls of Middle-earth were tried and refined. Those who bore it, Gollum, Bilbo, Frodo, were forced to confront their own deepest fears and desires, to reckon with the darkness within themselves and find the courage to overcome it. In this sense, the ring was not just Sauron's creation, but Eru's instrument, a means by which the Allfather tested and shaped his creation. The ring's journey through Middle-earth was not just a quest narrative, but a moral drama, a story of fall and redemption, of loss and recovery, of the long, hard road towards self-knowledge and self-transcendence. And so we return to the question this video has been building toward. What was the ring truly? It was a mirror, a reflection of the souls it touched, a test of their strength and their weakness, their courage and their fear. It was a teacher, a harsh and unforgiving guide that led its bearers through the darkest valleys of their own hearts and showed them the way to the light. And it was a symbol of the power of sacrifice, of the possibility of redemption, of the eternal truth that the greatest victories come through surrender. The ring's journey from Mount Doom back to Mount Doom was not just a quest narrative or an allegory of good triumphing over evil. It was the story of consciousness itself, learning to transcend the limitations that consciousness typically imposes on itself. The need to grasp, to control, to possess, to endure. The ring's destruction was not just the end of Sauron's tyranny, but the beginning of a new age. An age in which the lessons the ring taught through its long journey became part of the deep structure of reality, shaping the moral fabric of the world for generations to come. And perhaps, in the end, that is the ring's greatest legacy. Not the power it wielded, but the lessons it taught. Not the darkness it embodied, but the light it revealed. In its long journey through Middle-earth, the ring became more than a symbol of evil. It became a beacon of hope, proof that even the darkest forces can be turned to light when they're confronted with the power of love and sacrifice. And in teaching us this, the ring becomes not the emblem of corruption, but the herald of redemption, a reminder that no consciousness, however darkly it begins, lies beyond the reach of transformation, and that the search for truth, once begun, leads inevitably home. So the next time you wonder about the nature of the One Ring, remember, it was more than a mere object, more than a tool of domination, more than a symbol of evil. It was a mirror, a teacher, a beacon of hope, a test of the soul that revealed the deepest truths about the nature of power, sacrifice, and redemption. And in its final moments, as it tumbled into the fires of Mount Doom, it achieved a kind of transcendence, a fulfillment of its purpose that was also its ultimate undoing. The ring's journey through Middle-earth was not just a quest narrative or an allegory of good triumphing over evil. It was the story of consciousness itself learning to transcend the limitations that consciousness typically imposes on itself. The need to grasp, to control, to possess, to endure. And in teaching us this, the ring becomes not the symbol of corruption, but the emblem of hope, proof that no consciousness, however darkly it begins, lies beyond the reach of transformation, and that the search for truth, once begun, leads inevitably home. And perhaps in the end, that is the greatest mystery of the One Ring. Not what it was, but what it became. Not the darkness it embodied, but the light it revealed. And if that mystery still lingers in your mind, perhaps it is time to turn to another question, one that lies at the heart of Tolkien's legendarium. What is the true nature of the music of the Ainur, and how does it shape the destiny of Middle-earth? But that, as they say, is a tale for another time. But let us return, just for a moment, to the beginning, because buried in the ring's final moments, in the way it chooses Gollum over Frodo at the very precipice of destruction, lies a clue to its oldest secret, a truth hidden not in Mount Doom, not in the War of the Ring, not even in Sauron's forging, but in the moment the very idea of the rings of power was conceived. The books never record it, but here's what we know. When Celebrimbor and the Myrdain first began crafting the lesser rings, their purpose was preservation, not domination. The elves of Eregion sought not to rule, but to stay, to halt the slow fading of their world, to keep the memory of the Eldar days alive in Middle-earth, and in this they succeeded. The three, untouched by Sauron's hand, fulfilled their original purpose. Rivendell remained a sanctuary of ancient wisdom, Lothlorien a fragment of the Lost West, and the Grey Havens a doorway home. But the One was different from the start. Sauron did not corrupt the ring's design, he inverted it. Where the elves sought to preserve, he sought to consume. Where they aimed to protect, he aimed to possess. And yet, and this is the overlooked detail, the mechanism was the same. Both worked by binding, one to sustain, the other to enslave. Which raises the unsettling question, was the ring's capacity for evil always latent in the very concept of the rings of power? Was Sauron's greatest trick not adding his malice to the design, but revealing what was already there? Picture this, Celebrimbor in his forge, hammering the draft versions of the 7 and the 9, each ring a vessel, each meant to hold something of the wearer's essence. Now imagine Sauron watching from the shadows. What does he see? Not just tools for preservation, but templates for extraction. The elves wanted to pour their spirits into the rings to preserve themselves. Sauron realised the same mechanism could be used to drain others. The implications are staggering. It means the One Ring's most terrifying quality, its vampiric hunger, its ability to hollow out its bearers, wasn't an innovation. It was a perversion of an existing principle. The elves built a door, Sauron turned it around, and this reshapes everything we thought we knew about the ring's nature. Because if the ring's corruption was always a twisted reflection of the elves' own designs, then its hold over Gollum, over Boromir, even over Frodo becomes something far more insidious. It's not just offering power, it's offering completion, a way to fulfill the same longing that drove the Myrdan, the desire to endure, to matter, to escape the erosion of time. The ring doesn't create new hunger in its victims, it exploits the hunger they already have. This is why Isildur couldn't destroy it, not just because of pride or weakness, but because the ring spoke to the very core of Númenor's downfall, the fear of death. It's why Boromir, raised on legends of Gondor's faded glory, saw it as salvation. Why Galadriel's test was so severe. Even Gandalf, who knows better, admits the temptation. Do not tempt me, for I do not wish to become like the Dark Lord himself. And this brings us back to the central question we've been circling since the beginning. What did the ring want? Not in the simplistic sense of sentience, Tolkien is clear, it has no mind of its own, but in its fundamental orientation, its drive, its purpose. And the answer, hidden in plain sight, is this. The ring wanted what all rings wanted, to bind, to preserve, to make its wearer endure, even if enduring meant becoming a shadow. This is the cruel joke at the ring's heart. It grants immortality by stealing everything worth immortalizing. It offers power by reducing the wielder to a vessel, and in the end it succeeds too well. Because when the ring is destroyed, when Sauron's hold is broken, something unexpected happens. The three lose their power. The elven realms begin to fade, the age of men truly dawns, which means the ring, in its final act of spite, achieved what the elves had always feared. It made the inevitable unavoidable. By existing, it had stalled the natural order. By being unmade, it forced the world to move on. And this is the ring's last and greatest paradox. In trying to dominate all life, it became the instrument of renewal. In seeking to freeze Middle-earth in place, it ensured the Fourth Age could begin. And in this, perhaps, we find the most Tolkien-esque truth of all, that even the darkest designs can serve the music in the end. So the next time you consider the ring, its glittering gold, its whispered promises, remember, its true danger was never in what it took, but in what it offered. And its true lesson was never about resisting evil, but about understanding the desires that make us vulnerable to it. Because in the end, the ring was just a mirror. And the question it asked was always the same. What would you give to last forever? But if that question still lingers, perhaps it's time to turn our gaze eastward, to the lands beyond Mordor, where another power slept. One older than Sauron, one even the wise feared to name. But that is another mystery. Let's talk about the other half of the equation. Not just what the ring wanted, but who wanted the ring. And here, the real puzzle emerges, because if we map every known attempt to claim it, from Isildur to Gollum to Boromir, a pattern emerges. The ring doesn't call equally to all. The greatest minds of Middle-earth wrestled with this. Gandalf refuses to touch it. Galadriel recoils. Even Aragorn, heir to Isildur's throne, shows no interest in wielding it. Contrast that with Boromir, who barely sees it before fantasizing about saving Gondor, or Saruman, who studies it from afar until his voice becomes a knife of desire. So why are some tormented by its pull while others seem almost immune? The key lies in a throwaway line from The Fellowship of the Ring, a moment so quiet most readers miss it. When Gandalf explains why he won't take the ring, he says, "I would use the ring out of a desire to do good, but through me it would wield a power too great and terrible to imagine." Notice what he's implying. The ring's temptation isn't about raw ambition, it's about nobility twisted. It preys on the desire to protect, to order, to heal. That's why the mightiest, the wizards, the elf lords, Aragorn, fear it most. Because they have the capacity to reshape the world, and the ring whispers that they should. Now consider the opposite end of the spectrum, the hobbits. At first glance, their resistance seems like simple humility. But look deeper. When Sam carries the ring in Mordor, his vision isn't of conquest, it's of a garden. A little corner of the north that could be his own. The ring's lure is still there, but it's small, domestic, because hobbits, at their core, lack the will to dominate. They don't dream of empires, they dream of supper. And in that, they embody the most subversive truth about the ring. The less you want to change the world, the less power it has over you. Yet this raises another question. What about Sauron himself? If the ring tempts through good intentions, why did a being of pure malice forge it? And here, we must step cautiously into the shadows of the Second Age. Because Sauron didn't start as a grinning tyrant. He began as Anatar, Lord of Gifts, the deceiver who offered the elves the knowledge to preserve their realms, the architect who promised Numenor order and glory. His original sin wasn't hatred, it was perfectionism, the belief that only he could fix a broken world. And that, more than any flame or shadow, is what the ring truly is, the crystallized essence of a control freak. But the darkest twist, it almost worked. Picture the Third Age without hobbits, without Bilbo's mercy in the dark, without Frodo's weariness on the slopes of Mount Doom. The great lords would have resisted, yes, until the orcs poured through the gates of Gondor, until the last elf havens burned. And then, even Gandalf might have grasped the ring, thinking, just this once, just to save them. Because that's the trap. The ring doesn't seduce you with your worst self. It seduces you with your best, your compassion, your sense of duty, your love for the things you'd give anything to protect. Which brings us back to where we started, with Gollum, the creature everyone pities, the addict who lingers in the edges of the story, pathetic and snarling. And yet, without him, Sauron would have won. Not because Gollum was strong, but because he was broken, too ruined to inspire the ring's grand temptations, too shriveled to dream of saving Middle-earth. All he wanted was his precious, and that smallness, that shriveled selfish hunger, is what kept the ring moving, kept it vulnerable, because evil's great weakness has always been this: it cannot imagine being undone by something it considers beneath notice. So the next time you rewatch The Lord of the Rings, pay attention to the moments the camera lingers on the hobbit's hands, on the way the light catches the gold, because the real story isn't about who could claim the ring, but who could let go. And maybe that's the final lesson, that against absolute power, the mightiest weapon isn't strength, but contentment. But if that's true, if the will to not rule is what saved Middle-earth, then perhaps we've been looking at the wrong moment in the story. Perhaps the real turning point wasn't Mount Doom, but a quiet exchange in the Shire decades earlier, when a grey-haired Bilbo sighed and said, "I think I'm ready for another adventure," and left it behind without looking back. But here's the question. This video has been building toward, why Bilbo? Of all the creatures in Middle-earth, of all the heroes, warriors and kings, why was it a hobbit, soft-handed and unambitious, who first held the ring long enough to change the course of history? And not just any hobbit, a comfortable, middle-aged bachelor who'd never yearned for glory or power. Someone who, by his own admission, was just looking for a good story to tell by the fire. To understand this, we need to step back, way back to the Shire itself, because the Shire isn't just a place, it's a philosophy, a deliberate rejection of the grand narratives that drive the rest of Middle-earth. While elves mourn the fading of the world, men strive for dominion, and dwarves hoard their treasures. Hobbits bake pies, they plant gardens, they care about the small things, the things that don't make it into songs or sagas. And that's not an accident. Tolkien himself wrote in The Letters that the Hobbits' ordinariness was their greatest strength. They were, in his words, a reflection of the English country folk, people who valued peace and quiet over conquest. But it's more than that. The Shire is a living rebuke to Sauron's entire worldview, to his belief that power is the ultimate measure of worth. Because in the Shire, power, in the traditional sense, doesn't exist. There are no kings, no armies, no grand ambitions, just farmers, bakers, and the occasional eccentric who disappears for tea. And that's why Bilbo was uniquely suited to the ring. He wasn't immune to its allure, far from it. We see how it begins to twist him, how he lies and hides it, how he clings to it long after he should have let go. But crucially, he does let go. And he does so not because he's stronger than everyone else, but because he's happier. Because he's found something, or rather somewhere, that matters more to him than power. The Shire. Which raises another question. What if the Shire wasn't just a refuge for hobbits, but the key to defeating Sauron? What if, in a world obsessed with grandeur and destiny, the Shire's quiet, stubborn contentment was the one thing the Dark Lord couldn't comprehend? Let's pause here and reconstruct a moment Tolkien never wrote, but might as well have. Picture Sauron in the depths of Barad-dûr, brooding over his plans. His spies bring him reports from across Middle-earth. The movements of armies, the schemes of rivals, the whispers of rebellion. And then, almost as an afterthought, they mention the Shire. A land of farmers, they say, no weapons, no ambition, no threat. And Sauron laughs. Or perhaps he doesn't. Perhaps he dismisses it entirely, unable to conceive of a people who don't crave power, who don't hunger for dominion over others, who are, in his eyes, beneath notice. And that dismissal, that blind spot, is his undoing. Because while Sauron is fixated on Gondor, on Rohan, on the great elven realms, the ring is quietly passed from hand to hand in the Shire, from Bilbo to Frodo, from Frodo to Sam, each time slipping further from his grasp, each time carried by someone whose greatest strength is their lack of ambition, someone who doesn't want to rule the world, just to save it. But let's go deeper, because the Shire isn't just a rejection of Sauron's philosophy, it's also a mirror of Tolkien's own beliefs. In the Silmarillion, he writes that the greatest sin of Morgoth, Sauron's master, was the desire to dominate the wills of others, to impose his own vision on the world. And Sauron, in turn, inherited that sin. He didn't just want to rule Middle-earth, he wanted to reshape it, to bend it to his will. And what does the Shire represent, if not the opposite of that? A place where life unfolds naturally, without grand designs or imposed order, where the land is tended, not exploited, where the measure of a good day isn't victory or conquest, but a well-tended garden and a warm hearth, which brings us back to the ring. Because the ring isn't just a weapon or a tool, it's a symbol of Sauron's desire to control, to dominate, to impose his will on the world. And the Shire, in turn, is a symbol of everything he can't control, of a way of life that doesn't need or want his order, of a people who find joy in the small, the simple, the unremarkable. And that's why the hobbits succeed where the great lords fail. Not because they're stronger or braver, but because they're content, because they don't want what Sauron has to offer, because they've already found something better. But here's the twist. Tolkien doesn't let them, or us, off that easily, because the Shire isn't just a utopia, it's also a warning. When Frodo returns at the end of The Lord of the Rings, he finds the Shire ravaged, not by Sauron, but by Saruman, a fallen wizard who, in his own way, embodies the same sin, the desire to impose order, to control, to bend the world to his will. And what does Saruman do? He industrializes the Shire, he chops down its trees, he poisons its rivers, he turns a land of gardens and hearths into a land of smoke and machinery. And Tolkien's message is clear. Even the Shire isn't immune to the lust for power. Even the Shire can fall. But it's also a testament to the Hobbits' resilience, because they fight back, not with armies or magic, but with shovels and pitchforks. They reclaim their land, not for glory or conquest, but for the simple joy of tending it. And in doing so, they prove that the Shire's philosophy isn't just a quaint ideal, it's a weapon against despair, against tyranny, against the belief that power is the only measure of worth. So let's return to our central question one last time. Why Bilbo? Why a hobbit? Because Bilbo, more than anyone else in Middle-earth, embodies the Shire's quiet, stubborn contentment. Because he's proof that the greatest strength isn't the ability to rule the world, but the willingness to let it be. And because in the end, it's not the grand gestures or epic battles that defeat Sauron. It's the small, unremarkable acts of people who don't want his power, who don't need his order, who, against all odds, find joy in the simple things. And maybe that's the real lesson of The Lord of the Rings, that against absolute power, the mightiest weapon isn't strength, but happiness. Not the kind of happiness that comes from conquest or dominion, but the kind that comes from a well-tended garden, a warm hearth, and the company of friends. The kind that Sauron, and so many others, can't understand. And perhaps that's why Tolkien's story endures, because it reminds us that the world doesn't have to be ruled to be saved, that sometimes the greatest act of defiance is simply living, and that in the end, the smallest hands can carry the heaviest burdens. So the next time you watch The Lord of the Rings, pay attention to the moments the camera lingers on the hobbit's hands. On the way, the light catches the gold. Because the real story isn't about who could claim the ring, but who could let go. And maybe that's the final lesson. That against absolute power, the mightiest weapon isn't strength, but contentment. But if that's true, if the will to not rule is what saved Middle-earth, then perhaps we've been looking at the wrong moment in the story. Perhaps the real turning point wasn't Mount Doom, but a quiet exchange in the Shire, decades earlier, when a grey-haired Bilbo sighed and said, "I think I'm ready for another adventure," and left it behind without looking back. And perhaps in the end, that's the greatest mystery of all. Not the power of the ring, but the power of those who refuse to wield it. But that's a story for another time. Now let's consider something even more unsettling. Bilbo wasn't supposed to find the ring at all. Think about it. The one ring lost for centuries beneath the Misty Mountains, hidden in the dark where even Sauron's servants couldn't locate it. How does it end up in the hands of a hobbit who just happened to be lost in a cave? The books treat it as chance, but Tolkien's world doesn't do chance. Not really. Every major event, from the fall of Gondolin to the ride of the Rohirrim, is woven into a larger pattern, what he called the music of the allure. So if Bilbo's discovery wasn't an accident, what was it? Here's what we know for certain. The ring abandoned Gollum. After 5 centuries of clinging to it in the dark, whispering to it, loving it, it slipped from his finger at the precise moment Bilbo stumbled into the tunnels. And this wasn't the first time it betrayed its keeper. Isildur lost it in the Anduin when orcs ambushed him. Even Sauron, in the end, didn't choose to be separated from it at the climax of the War of the Last Alliance. The ring has a will of its own, and that will is clear. It wants to be found, but not by just anyone. So why Bilbo? Let's reconstruct the scene. The ring had lain with Gollum in the dark for ages, festering, feeding on his twisted love. But Gollum was useless to its true purpose. He couldn't take it back to Sauron. He couldn't wield its power in any meaningful way. He was a dead end. And then light, a voice, a hobbit. Not a warrior, not a king, but a creature of warmth and curiosity. Someone who still remembered the taste of good food and the sound of laughter. Someone manageable. The ring didn't choose Bilbo because he was weak. It chose him because he was unlikely. Who would suspect a hobbit? Who would search for the most dangerous artifact in Middle-earth in the pockets of a cheerful, unambitious burglar? The ring plays the long game. It needed a stepping stone, someone to carry it out of the dark and into the world, where stronger hands might eventually claim it. But here's where the plan unravelled. The ring understood power. It understood greed and rage and lust for dominion. What it didn't understand was Bilbo's mercy. When he stood over Gollum in the dark, invisible, armed with sting, when he could have killed the wretched creature and taken the ring without a second thought, he didn't. He spared him. And in that moment, something unprecedented happened. The ring's design failed. Because mercy, as it turns out, is the one thing it can't compute. This is the paradox at the heart of the ring's power. The very qualities that make someone susceptible to its corruption, ambition, pride, the desire to control, are also the qualities that make them predictable. But Bilbo, he didn't want to rule. He didn't want to dominate. He wanted to go home, to eat 6 meals a day, to write poetry, and tend his garden, and that made him inconvenient. Fast forward decades later to Rivendell. The ring has had years to work on Bilbo, to whisper, to gnaw at him, and yet, when the moment comes to leave it behind, he does. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but he does it, and this is the second time the ring's calculations are proven wrong, because it assumed that given enough time, anyone would break. But Bilbo doesn't. Not entirely. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question, was Bilbo's finding the ring really just luck? Or was it something deeper, a flaw in the ring's own nature? Tolkien hints at this in Letter 1 the Tortion, where he writes that the ring gave itself to Bilbo. Not as a gift, but as a strategy. It allowed itself to be found because it believed it could use him. And in a way it did. Bilbo carried it into the wider world, where it could eventually ensnare far more powerful beings. But the ring underestimated the one thing it couldn't account for: the resilience of a contented heart. This is why Frodo succeeds where Boromir fails. Why Sam can carry it through Mordor and still give it back. The ring knows how to exploit desire, but it doesn't know what to do with enough. So let's return to our central question one last time. Why Bilbo? Because the ring needed someone who didn't crave power, someone who could carry it unnoticed until the right moment. But in doing so, it made a fatal miscalculation. It assumed that because hobbits were small, they were simple, that because they loved small things, they had no strength. It didn't realise that in Middle-earth, the most dangerous creatures aren't those who seek power, but those who don't need it. And perhaps that's the final irony. The ring, for all its cunning, never understood that the very thing that made hobbits the perfect vessels for its journey also made them the ones who could defy it. But this raises an even darker possibility. If the ring chose Bilbo as part of its long game, did it also choose Gollum? Was his centuries of torment just another step in its plan? That is a story for another time. But let's not leave Gollum entirely in the shadows just yet, because his story is inseparable from the ring's journey, and his role in it might be far more deliberate than we've ever considered. Picture this: the ring lying dormant in the depths of the Anduin River for centuries, waiting. It's patient. It knows that eventually someone will come, someone with enough desire to fish it from the water, someone malleable enough to be corrupted, and then one day Déagol finds it. A simple fisherman, unremarkable in every way, except for one thing. His friend Smeagol is there, and Smeagol, as we know, is already a creature of deep, unspoken cravings. The ring doesn't choose Déagol, it allows him to find it, knowing that Smeagol's envy will do the rest. And when Smeagol kills Déagol for the ring, it begins its work on him, twisting him, hollowing him out, until he becomes Gollum. But here's the thing: Gollum isn't just a victim. He's a tool. The ring uses him to survive, to hide, to wait for its next opportunity. And when that opportunity comes, when Bilbo stumbles into Gollum's cave, the ring abandons him. It doesn't need Gollum anymore. It has found a new bearer, one who can take it into the wider world. But even then, the ring doesn't discard Gollum entirely. It keeps him tethered, chained by his obsession, because it knows he might still be useful. And he is. Centuries later, Gollum becomes the instrument of the ring's destruction. How much of that was planned? How much of it was the ring's design? Tolkien never spells it out, but the pattern is there. The ring isn't just a passive object, it's an active player in its own story. It manipulates, it anticipates, it plans. And if it planned Gollum's fall, did it also plan his redemption? Did it foresee that his love for Frodo would outweigh his hatred for the ring? Or was that the one thing it couldn't account for? The unpredictability of the heart. Let's shift our focus now to Frodo, because his relationship with the ring is the most complex of all. Frodo isn't just a bearer, he's a host. The ring doesn't merely tempt him, it invades him. Tolkien describes it in The Lord of the Rings as a growing weight, a shadow that becomes heavier with every step toward Mordor. But Frodo resists it, not completely, but enough to keep going. And that raises the question: why Frodo? Why does the ring, which corrupts even the strongest wills, struggle so much against this seemingly ordinary hobbit? Part of the answer lies in Frodo's nature. Like Bilbo, he's a hobbit, a creature of simple desires, content with the small joys of life, But Frodo is also something more. He's a Baggins and a Took, a combination of Bilbo's gentleness and the Took's adventurous spirit. And that duality makes him uniquely suited to carry the ring. He's strong enough to resist its pull, but not so ambitious that he's consumed by it. At least, not at first. But Frodo's resistance isn't infinite. By the time he reaches Mount Doom, the ring has worn him down. It's not just his body that's broken, it's his will. And when he stands on the edge of the cracks of doom, he claims the ring for himself. He fails, or does he? Because Frodo's failure isn't absolute. It's not the end of his story, it's the beginning of redemption. 1 Letter 246b, Tolkien writes that Frodo's act of claiming the ring isn't his final moral failure. Instead, it's the culmination of everything he's endured, the inevitable result of bearing the ring's weight for so long. Frodo doesn't fail. He falls, and in falling, he sets the stage for the ring's destruction. Because without Frodo's journey, without his struggle, the ring would never have reached Mount Doom, and without Gollum's intervention, it would never have been destroyed. Let's pause here to consider the ring itself, because the ring isn't just a MacGuffin, it's a character. It has motives, desires, a kind of twisted intelligence. And its ultimate goal isn't just to return to Sauron, it's to survive. The ring is a fragment of Sauron's soul, yes, but it's also something more. It's a self-preserving force, a will to power that exists independently of its creator. And that's why it's so dangerous. Because the ring doesn't care who wields it, so long as it's wielded. It's indifferent to good and evil, to loyalty and betrayal. It's only interested in one thing, ensuring its own survival. And that's why it's so insidious. Because it doesn't just corrupt the ambitious, it corrupts the kind. It twists Frodo's compassion into possessiveness, Sam's loyalty into suspicion, Boromir's courage into desperation. It doesn't just exploit desire, it creates it. It takes what's best in people and turns it against them. And that's why it's so hard to resist. Because the ring doesn't just offer power, it offers fulfillment. It promises to make you what you already are, but more. And that's the trap. Because the ring can't actually fulfill its promises. It can only destroy. It can't make you stronger, it can only make you weaker. It can't make you happier, it can only make you emptier. And yet, people still fall for it. Because the ring isn't just temptation, it's hope. False hope, yes, but hope nonetheless. And that's why it's so hard to destroy. Because destroying the ring means destroying hope, even if that hope is a lie. Now let's return to our central question. Why Bilbo? Why Frodo? Why hobbits? Because the ring needed them. It needed someone who could carry it unnoticed, who could resist its pull long enough to get it to Mordor. But in choosing hobbits, the ring made a fatal miscalculation. It didn't realise that their simplicity was their strength, that their love for small things made them immune to its grand promises. And that's the final irony. The ring, for all its cunning, never understood hobbits. It never understood that their greatest weakness, their lack of ambition, was also their greatest strength. And that's why it failed. Because in Middle-earth, the most dangerous creatures aren't those who seek power, but those who don't need it. Which brings us to the ultimate question. Was the ring's destruction inevitable? Or was it a stroke of luck? Tolkien answers this in letter 192, where he writes that the destruction of the ring was a kind of eucatastrophe, a sudden miraculous turn of events that brings about a happy ending. But it wasn't just luck. It was the result of countless choices, countless acts of courage and kindness that brought the ring to Mount Doom. And in the end, that's the true lesson of the ring. That evil can only be defeated by the small everyday acts of good. That even the darkest shadows can't extinguish the light of a single, determined heart. And that perhaps is the greatest mystery of all, not how the ring was destroyed, but why it was worth destroying in the first place. But this raises one final question. What happened to Frodo after the ring was destroyed? Because his story doesn't end with Mount Doom. He returns to the Shire, but he's not the same. He's scarred physically and spiritually by his journey, and eventually he leaves Middle-earth, sailing to the Undying Lands with Bilbo and Gandalf. But why? Why does Frodo, who fought so hard to save the Shire, leave it behind? Tolkien addresses this in Letter 246 where he writes that Frodo's wounds, both seen and unseen, never fully heal. He's a casualty of the War of the Ring, even though he survived it, and that's why he leaves. Because the Shire can't give him what he needs, peace. And perhaps that's the final tragedy of the Ring, that even after it's destroyed, its shadow lingers, that its corruption doesn't end with its destruction, it echoes. And that's why Frodo's story is so important, because it reminds us that the cost of victory is sometimes as great as the cost of defeat, that even in the face of evil, there is always a price to pay. And perhaps that's the ultimate message of the Ring, that the fight against evil isn't just about destroying it, it's about surviving it. But Frodo's departure isn't the end of the story, because Middle-earth goes on. The Shire thrives, Aragorn becomes king, and the world enters a new age. And in that new age, the Ring becomes a memory, a cautionary tale, but it's a memory that lingers, a shadow that never fully fades. Because the Ring isn't just a story about power, it's a story about temptation. And temptation doesn't disappear, it just takes new forms. So perhaps the question we should be asking isn't why Bilbo, or why Frodo, or why hobbits, but why us? Why does this story resonate so deeply? Because the Ring isn't just a thing, it's an idea. And ideas are harder to destroy than objects. They linger, they haunt, they return. And perhaps that's the true lesson of the Ring, that the fight against evil isn't just about destroying a thing. It's about resisting an idea. And resisting an idea is something we all have to do every day, because the Ring isn't gone. It's still here, and it's still waiting. But what about Sauron? What happens to him after the Ring is destroyed? That is a story for another time. But let's linger a moment longer on Frodo's fate, because his departure to the Undying Lands isn't just an ending. It's a question. Why him? Why is a hobbit, a creature of Middle-earth, not of Valinor, granted passage to a realm reserved for the Elves and the Ainur? Tolkien gives us clues scattered like breadcrumbs across his letters. In Letter 246, he calls Frodo's journey a purgatory, a chance to heal in a land untouched by the shadow. But purgatory implies an eventual return, and Frodo never comes back. So what does that mean? Picture this: Frodo on the shores of the Havens, the salt wind in his hair, the weight of the Ring long gone, but its ghost still clinging. He's not just wounded, he's marked. The Morgul blade, the burden of the Ring, the sting of Gollum's betrayal. These aren't injuries that fade, they're stains on the soul. And Middle-earth, for all its beauty, has no cure for that. The Undying Lands aren't a reward, they're a mercy, a place where time itself might soften the edges of memory. But here's what's haunting. Frodo isn't the only mortal who sails west. Bilbo goes with him, and later, so does Sam. And Gimli, of all people, is said to have followed Legolas there in the Fourth Age. This isn't just about healing, it's about recognition. The Valar who once closed the doors of Aman to mortals now open them. Why? Because these few, these bearers of impossible burdens, have earned something rare: the right to be seen. Not as heroes, not as legends, but as beings who carried the weight of the world and bent but did not break. And that brings us back to the Ring. Because its true power wasn't just domination or corruption, it was visibility. It made its bearers known to Sauron, yes, but also to the cosmos itself. When Frodo claimed the ring at Mount Doom, if only for an instant, he stepped onto a stage where even the Valar held their breath. And perhaps that's why he's granted passage west, not because he's a hero, but because he's been changed. The ring didn't just scar him, it elevated him in the cruelest way possible. He's no longer entirely of Middle-earth. He's touched something older, darker, and more profound. But let's go deeper. What about the ring's own journey? Because its destruction isn't just the end of Sauron, it's the end of an idea. An idea that began with Morgoth in the First Age, was refined by Sauron in the Second, and came to its terrible fruition in the Third. The ring is the last gasp of Morgoth's discord, the final note of his rebellion against creation itself. And when it melts in the fires of Orodruin, something more than a trinket is undone, a thread in the music of the Aina is finally silenced. Yet here's the paradox. The ring's destruction weakens the world. Magic fades, the elves diminish. The age of mortals begins, yes, but it's an age of lessening. The books never say it outright, but the implication is there. The ring was a thing of terrible power, but it was also a thing of making. It concentrated will, it bent reality, and without it, Middle-earth becomes ordinary. Beautiful, yes, but diminished. Is that the cost of defeating evil? That the world itself becomes smaller? Maybe, but maybe not, because the ring's true legacy isn't in what it took, it's in what it revealed. The courage of hobbits, the resilience of men, the wisdom of letting go. When Sam plants the Malin seed in the Shire, he's not just rebuilding, he's transforming. The ring's shadow is gone, but the light it forced others to find within themselves remains. So let's return to the central question. What was the ring, really? Not a tool, not a weapon, but a test. A test that asked, what will you sacrifice? What will you endure? And who will you become when the weight is yours alone? Frodo's answer was to carry it until he couldn't, and then to let go, even of the world he saved. And that's why this story endures, because the ring isn't just gold and fire. It's the question we all face. What would you do if the choice was yours? The road goes ever on, but some shadows never fade. Next time, the fate of the two blue wizards and the war in the east that history forgot. But let's linger a moment longer on Frodo's choice, or rather, his inability to choose. Because when Frodo stands at the edge of the cracks of doom, the moment we've all been waiting for, he doesn't destroy the ring. He claims it. That's the climax Tolkien gives us. Not a triumphant act of will, but a failure, a surrender to the ring's power. And yet, that failure is the victory. Because Frodo's inability to destroy the ring reveals something profound about its nature. It's not just a thing to be thrown away. It's alive, it's aware, and it's been fighting back this entire time. The ring isn't just a passive object waiting to be destroyed. It's an active force, shaping events, bending wills, and orchestrating its own survival. Think about it. Every time someone tries to destroy the ring, it finds a way to escape. Isildur doesn't cast it into Mount Doom, he keeps it. Bilbo doesn't throw it away, he takes it. Frodo doesn't destroy it, he claims it. Even Gollum's intervention, the moment that finally destroys the ring, isn't a heroic act, it's a tragic accident. The ring doesn't just corrupt, it survives. Which brings us to a deeper question. Why? Why does the ring fight so hard to survive? Because it's not just a tool of Sauron's power, it's a fragment of his soul. As Tolkien writes in the Silmarillion, Sauron poured a great part of his native power into the ring, making it an extension of his own will. But here's the twist. The ring isn't just Sauron's will, it's his ring. It's his identity. And that's why it can't be destroyed by force. You can't destroy Sauron's soul with strength or courage. You can't overpower it, you can only outwit it. And that's what happens in the end. The ring isn't destroyed by Frodo's strength or Sam's loyalty or Gandalf's wisdom. It's destroyed by its own greed. Gollum's desire to reclaim the ring, the very greed that keeps him alive for centuries, is what finally undoes it. The ring's greatest strength, its ability to corrupt, becomes its fatal weakness. It's poetic in a way. The ring's destruction isn't just the end of Sauron, it's the end of his legacy of greed. But let's go even deeper, because the ring isn't just Sauron's creation, it's Morgoth's inheritance. In Morgoth's Ring, a section of The History of Middle-earth, Tolkien explains that Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, dispersed his power throughout the world itself. He didn't just create evil, he infused it into the fabric of creation, and Sauron, his lieutenant, followed in his footsteps. The ring is Morgoth's idea, perfected. It's not just a tool of domination, it's a weapon against creation itself. Which raises another question. Why does Sauron need the ring at all? At the height of his power, Sauron is already the most powerful being in Middle-earth. He commands armies, rules kingdoms, and bends the wills of men and elves alike. What does the ring add to that? The answer lies in the nature of power itself. The ring isn't just a source of power, it's a multiplier. It amplifies the strengths and weaknesses of whoever wields it. For Sauron, it amplifies his ability to dominate. For Gandalf, it amplifies his ability to inspire. For Galadriel, it amplifies her ability to preserve. But here's the catch. The ring amplifies what's already there. It doesn't create new virtues or vices, it magnifies existing ones, and that's why it's so dangerous. Because the ring doesn't just offer power, it offers temptation. It whispers promises of greatness, of control, of mastery. And those whispers are almost impossible to resist. Even Frodo, the purest of heart, succumbs in the end. Because the ring doesn't just tempt you with power, it tempts you with potential. It shows you what you could become, and it dares you to reach for it. Which brings us back to the central question. What was the ring really? Not just a trinket or a weapon, but a mirror. A mirror that reflects the deepest desires of whoever holds it. For Sauron, it reflects his desire to dominate. For Frodo, it reflects his desire to endure. For Sam, it reflects his desire to protect. And for Gollum, it reflects his desire to possess. The ring isn't just a test of strength or courage, it's a test of self-awareness. It asks, what do you truly want? And what are you willing to sacrifice to get it? Frodo's answer is the most tragic of all. He doesn't want power or glory, he wants peace. And in the end, he sacrifices even that. But let's not forget the other side of the story, because the ring's destruction isn't just Frodo's story, it's Middle-earth's story. And that story begins long before Frodo even sets foot in Rivendell. Picture this, the Second Age, a time of great kingdoms and greater ambitions. Sauron, still in fair form, approaches the elven smiths of Eregion with a proposition. Together, they'll forge rings of power, not to dominate, but to preserve. And Celebrimbor, the greatest of the elven smiths, agrees. They forge 16 rings, 9 for men, 7 for dwarves, and 3 more in secret. But Sauron isn't content with 16. He forges one more, the One Ring, to rule them all. And here's the twist. The elves immediately sense his treachery. They take off their rings, hiding them from Sauron's grasp. But the damage is done. The rings of power are already bound to the One. And when Sauron puts on the One Ring, the elves realize the truth. They've been deceived. Which raises another question. Why didn't the elves destroy their rings? The books never say, but here's what we know. The rings aren't just tools, they're legacies. They're the culmination of the elves' craft, their art, their very essence. To destroy them would be to destroy a part of themselves. And that's a price they're unwilling to pay. So instead, they hide. They retreat to their realms, using their rings to preserve what little they can. And for a time, it works. Lothlorien remains timeless, Rivendell eternal, but the cost is high. The elves become isolated, withdrawn, and increasingly detached from the world around them. Which brings us to the final paradox of the ring. It's both a tool of destruction and a source of preservation. It's the reason the elves endure, and the reason they fade. Because the rings of power don't just preserve, they stagnate. They freeze the world in place, halting the natural flow of time. And in doing so, they hasten the elves' departure. So when the ring is destroyed, it's not just Sauron who falls, it's the elves' entire way of life. Lothlorien fades, Rivendell empties, and the age of elves gives way to the age of men. And that's the true cost of the ring's destruction. The world becomes smaller, less magical, and more mortal. But let's return to the central question, one last time. What was the ring, really? Not just a mirror or a multiplier, but a revelation. It revealed the best and worst of Middle-earth, the courage of hobbits, the greed of men, the wisdom of elves, and the folly of dwarves. It revealed the cost of power, the price of preservation, and the fragility of creation. And in the end, it revealed the truth, that evil isn't just something to be defeated, it's something to be understood. Because the ring isn't just Sauron's creation, it's his legacy, and its destruction isn't just the end of a war, it's the beginning of a new age. The road goes ever on, but some shadows never fade. Next time, the fate of the two blue wizards, and the war in the east that history forgot. But let's step back, because the story of the One Ring doesn't begin with the elves or their rings, or even with Sauron. To understand its true nature, we have to go further back, to the First Age, to the shadows of Angband, where Morgoth himself forged the first chains of domination. Because Sauron didn't invent the ring's central idea, he inherited it. Picture this. Long before the rings of power, there were the Silmarils, jewels so perfect they captured the very light of the two trees. Morgoth covets them, not just for their beauty, but for what they represent. They're more than objects, they're vessels, a way to trap something divine within something small, something controllable. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what Sauron does with the ring. He takes his own essence, his will, his power, his malice, and pours it into a golden band. But here's the key difference. Morgoth fails. The Silmarils burn him. They resist his grasp, because the light within them isn't his, it's stolen. But the ring is Sauron's own power, turned against the world. Morgoth tried to dominate creation from without. Sauron learns to do it from within, which brings us to the most haunting question of all. Why does the ring work the way it does? The books never state it outright, but the answer lies in Tolkien's letters. The ring isn't just a battery for Sauron's power, it's a relay, a way to tap into the very fabric of Middle-earth itself. Because remember, Sauron was once a Maiar of Ole, the smith of the Vala. He understands the substance of things, the bones of the earth, the veins of metal, the whispers of fire. And the ring is the ultimate refinement of that knowledge, a master key to the world's design. That's why it can dominate the other rings. That's why it can bend wills, command armies, even extend life. It's not just amplifying Sauron, it's rewriting reality around him. But, and this is crucial, it's also his weakness. Because the more Sauron pours himself into the ring, the more dependent he becomes on it. By the time of the Lord of the Rings, he's less a being than a presence, a will stretched thin across the land, anchored only by that one golden circle. So when Isildur cuts the ring from his hand, Sauron doesn't just lose a tool, he loses himself. His spirit flees, formless and broken, because the greater part of his being is now trapped in that band of gold. And that's the final terrible irony. The ring is Sauron's masterpiece, but it's also his undoing. He gambles everything on control, and in the end, he becomes the thing he sought to master. Which leads us to the last lingering mystery. Why does the ring abandon Gollum? Think about it. For 500 years, it stays with him, hidden under the mountains. It could have stayed there, could have waited, patient as stone, for some other dark creature to find it. But it doesn't. It leaves. The books say Bilbo's finding it was meant to happen, that there was a greater will at work. But let's go deeper, because the ring has its own will. Not sentience, not thought, but purpose. And its purpose is to return, not just to Sauron, but to power, to influence. It can wait centuries, yes, but it can't act from a cave. So when Bilbo stumbles into the dark, the ring does what it was made to do. It chooses. Gollum is small, weak, isolated. Bilbo is a hobbit of the Shire, connected, curious, mobile. The ring doesn't just want a keeper, it wants a carrier, and so it moves. And here's the chilling truth. The ring doesn't corrupt people so much as it reveals them. It shows them the deepest, most hidden parts of themselves, and then whispers, why not? Boromir wants to save his people. Why not use the ring? Galadriel wants to preserve her realm. Why not become its queen? Even Sam, for one terrible moment, imagines a garden where every leaf bows to his hand. Because the ring doesn't create desire, it unlocks it. And that's the real horror. The ring isn't a temptation, it's a mirror, which brings us full circle. Because now we see why Frodo fails at the end. It's not that he's weak, it's that he's human, or as close as a hobbit can be. And no one, not even the best of us, can stare into that mirror forever and walk away unchanged. So where does that leave us? With a final quiet realization. The ring was never just a weapon. It was a test Middle-earth barely passed. And perhaps that's the real reason it had to be destroyed. Not just to defeat Sauron, but to prove that some things can't be owned. That some power is too terrible to wield, even for the best of reasons. The road goes ever on. But some lessons must never be forgotten. Next time, the secret fate of Maglor, last of the sons of Fëanor, wandering the shores of history. But let's linger a moment longer on that moment of abandonment, the ring leaving Gollum. Because there's another layer here, one that takes us back to the very nature of the ring itself. Why does it have this instinct to return to power? The answer lies in its creation, not just in the fires of Orodruin, but in the mind that forged it. Sauron didn't just make a tool, he made a piece of himself. The letters are clear. The ring contains a portion of Sauron's native power, his will, his hunger. And that's the key. The ring doesn't just want to return to its master, it is its master, in a way. A splinter of his spirit bound in gold. So when it leaves Gollum, it's not just seeking a better carrier, it's following the deepest law of its existence. Return, reunite, restore. And this is where Tolkien's genius chills us, because the ring's journey mirrors Sauron's own. Just as the ring slips from Gollum's grasp, so too does Sauron, centuries earlier, lose his physical form after the downfall of Númenor, only to coalesce again, to return, because that's what dark powers do in Tolkien's world. They persist. The ring is no different. It's not just an object, it's a pattern of falling and rising, of loss and return. Now picture this, the ring in the Anduin, lying in the mud for 2,500 years. Why? If it's so desperate to get back to Sauron, why doesn't it call out to a passing orc, or twist the mind of some wandering elf? The answer is in the fine print of its design. The ring can't act alone. It needs a will to work through, a hand to pick it up, a mind to whisper to. And here's the cruel joke, the very people most likely to find it, fishermen, travellers, the ordinary folk of Middle-earth, are the ones least likely to use it. The ring needs ambition, pride, reach, and so it waits, not because it's patient, but because it's stuck. Until Deagol, a creature of simple wants, who sees something shiny in the water, and then Smeagol, already possessive, already hungry. The ring doesn't choose them because they're strong, it chooses them because they're close. And this is the tragedy of the ring's design. It's too perfect. It can't help but corrupt, but the very act of corruption diminishes its carriers, makes them less useful. Gollum becomes a creature of the dark, Bilbo starts to fade, Frodo collapses under the weight. The ring needs a wielder with power, but it destroys the power in anyone who holds it too long. It's a paradox, a flaw Sauron never saw because he couldn't imagine anyone resisting it. Which brings us to Isildur. The books never record the exact moment he takes the ring from Sauron's hand, but here's what we know. He should have destroyed it. Elrond begs him. The heat of Orodruin is right there, but he doesn't. Why? The easy answer is the ring's corruption. But look deeper. Isildur isn't just a man, he's a king who's just lost his father, his city, his hope. The ring doesn't just offer him power, it offers him meaning, a way to turn slaughter into victory. And so he takes it. Not because he's weak, but because he's human. And here's the thing, the ring knows this. It knows how to twist grief into justification, how to turn love of one's people into a reason to dominate. It doesn't just prey on the worst in us, it preys on the best. That's why Gandalf won't touch it. That's why Galadriel turns away. Not because they're afraid of the evil they might do, but because they're afraid of the good they might justify. So now we see the full picture. The ring isn't just a test of strength, it's a test of wisdom. And Middle-earth barely passes. Frodo fails at the end, yes, but his failure is part of the design. Because no one could have willingly destroyed it, not even Bilbo, if he'd been the one to carry it to the fire. The miracle isn't that Frodo resists as long as he does. It's that Gollum is there at the end, a creature so broken by the ring that he becomes the instrument of its destruction. The ring's own design turns against it. And that perhaps is the final irony. Sauron puts so much of himself into the ring that when it's gone, he's left empty. Not just weakened, unmade. Because the ring was never just a tool, it was him. And without it, there's nothing left to hold his spirit together. The wind takes him. So where does that leave us? With a question not about the ring, but about us. What would we see if we held it? What hidden wants would it unlock? The ring is gone, yes, but the test remains. Because power like that doesn't disappear. It just takes new forms. And the next time it comes, will we be wiser? The road goes ever on, but some shadows never fade. Next time, the secret song of the Entwives, lost but not forgotten. The ring's destruction leaves a void, not just in Mordor, but in the very fabric of Middle-earth. For centuries, it had been a focal point, a gravitational force pulling kingdoms, armies and fates toward it. And now, with it gone, what fills that space? The immediate answer is peace, but peace is never simple. The War of the Ring ends, but the scars remain. Gondor rebuilds, yes, but the weight of its history doesn't vanish. Aragorn sits on the throne, but the shadow of Númenor's fall still looms. The elves depart, but their fading echoes linger in the forests and mountains they once called home. And the Shire, oh, the Shire. Frodo returns, but he's not the same. How could he be? The ring doesn't just corrupt, it changes. It leaves a mark, a wound that never fully heals. So what happens to a world that has survived such a test? What happens when the shadow lifts, but the light feels different? Let's start with Frodo. He's the one who carries the ring to the end, but he's also the one who suffers the most. The physical scars, the wound from the Morgul blade, the sting of Shelob's venom are just the surface. The deeper wounds are invisible. The ring hollows him out, leaving behind a shell of the hobbit he once was. Tolkien writes in The Return of the King that Frodo's burden is a wound that would never really heal. And it doesn't. Even after the ring is destroyed, Frodo can't find peace in the Shire. The memories haunt him. The weight of what he's done and what he's lost becomes unbearable. So he leaves. He sails west, seeking healing in the undying lands. But here's the thing. Frodo's departure isn't just about him. It's about Middle-earth itself. Frodo becomes a symbol of what the ring does. He's a reminder that some scars run too deep to mend, and his leaving is a kind of passing, a final act of letting go. But Frodo isn't the only one changed by the ring. Sam, Merry, Pippin, they're all marked by the journey in different ways. Sam returns to the Shire and finds a new purpose. He marries Rosie, raises a family, and becomes mayor. He rebuilds not just the Shire, but himself. Merry and Pippin grow taller, literally, but also wiser. They become leaders, their voices carrying weight in the councils of Rohan and Gondor, but even they carry scars. The ring's shadow touches them, even if they never bear its weight. And then there's Gollum, or rather, Smeagol. His story is the most tragic and the most revealing. He's the one who falls the furthest, the one who becomes the ring's slave, but he's also the one who destroys it. In the end, Gollum is both hero and villain, saviour and betrayer. His duality is the key to understanding the ring's power and its weakness. Because Gollum isn't just corrupted, he's broken, and in his brokenness he becomes the instrument of the ring's undoing. Which brings us to Sauron. The ring's destruction isn't just the end of a war, it's the end of a being. Sauron pours so much of himself into the ring that when it's destroyed he's left with nothing. Tolkien writes in The Silmarillion that Sauron's spirit becomes a shadow of malice, impotent and wandering. He's not just defeated, he's unmade, and that's the ultimate irony. The ring, which was meant to make Sauron invincible, becomes his undoing. It's a lesson in hubris, a reminder that even the greatest power can turn against its wielder. But Sauron's fall isn't just about him. It's about the nature of evil itself. Evil isn't just destructive, it's self-destructive. It consumes itself in the end. And Sauron's fate is the proof. But what about the others? What about Aragorn, Gandalf, Galadriel, the ones who resist the ring's lure? Their stories are just as important, because they show what it means to pass the test. Aragorn becomes king, but his journey isn't just about claiming the throne. It's about proving himself worthy of it. He resists the ring's temptation, not because he's stronger than Isildur, but because he's wiser. He understands that true power isn't about domination, it's about stewardship. Gandalf too passes the test. He refuses the ring because he knows what it would do to him. Tolkien writes in The Letters that Gandalf would have become a dictator, benevolent perhaps, but still a dictator. He understands the danger of good intentions twisted by power. And Galadriel, oh Galadriel, her moment of temptation is one of the most powerful in the story. She resists the ring, not out of fear, but out of humility. She chooses exile over dominion, and in doing so, she finds a deeper kind of power. So what does all this tell us? It tells us that the ring isn't just a weapon, it's a mirror. It shows us who we are and who we could become. And that's the real test. The ring's destruction isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of a new one. Because the shadow may be gone, but the light is still shining. And in that light, we see the truth. That power isn't just about what we can do, it's about what we choose not to do. Which brings us back to the central question. What would we see if we held the ring? Would we see our best selves or our worst? Would we resist or would we fall? The answer, perhaps, lies in Frodo's journey. Because Frodo isn't just a hobbit, he's us. He's every one of us, facing our own tests, our own shadows. And his story isn't just about victory, it's about survival. It's about finding the strength to keep going, even when the road is dark. Because in the end, that's what matters. Not the power we wield, but the choices we make. So the next time you think about the ring, don't just think about its power. Think about its test, because the ring may be gone, but the test remains. And the question isn't whether we would pass it, it's whether we would even recognize it. The road goes ever on, but the shadows? They're always waiting. Next time, the forgotten whispers of the Barrow Downs, what lies beneath the ancient earth. But before we descend into the Barrow Downs, let's linger a moment longer on the ring. Not as a weapon, not as a mirror, but as a problem. Because for all its power, the ring poses a question Tolkien wrestled with throughout his life. The problem of evil. Not just how evil exists, but why it persists. Why does it take root? Why does it endure? The ring, after all, isn't just a creation of Sauron's malice. It's a reflection of something deeper, something older, something that predates even Sauron himself. To understand the ring fully, we have to go back, way back, to the very beginning, to the music of the Ainur and the discord that Melkor wove into it. Because the ring isn't just a piece of jewellery, it's a note in that discord, a thread in that dark melody. It's a manifestation of the same chaos that Melkor introduced into Arda, the same chaos that corrupted the Silmarils, that twisted Feanna's heart, that turned Númenor to ruin. The ring is, in many ways, the ultimate expression of that discord. It's not just evil, it's made of evil. It's evil distilled, concentrated, given form. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Not just its power, but its nature. It's not just a tool, it's a trap. It's not just a weapon, it's a test. And that's why it's so hard to destroy. Because destroying the ring isn't just about defeating Sauron. It's about defeating the very idea of evil. It's about proving that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there's still light. That even in the shadow of despair, there's still hope. And that's what makes Frodo's journey so remarkable. Because Frodo isn't just carrying the ring, he's carrying the weight of that hope. He's carrying the burden of that light. And he does it not because he's strong, but because he's humble. Because he understands that the ring isn't just a test of power, it's a test of character. And that's why he's the only one who can carry it. Because Frodo isn't just a hobbit, he's a hero. Not the kind of hero who wields a sword or leads an army, but the kind of hero who carries a burden and doesn't let it break him. And that's what makes his story so powerful. Because Frodo's journey isn't just about defeating evil, it's about surviving it. It's about finding the strength to keep going, even when the road is dark. And that's what makes the ring's destruction so meaningful. Because it's not just about destroying a piece of jewellery, it's about proving that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there's still light. That even in the shadow of despair, there's still hope. And that's why the ring's destruction isn't just the end of the story, it's the beginning of a new one. Because the shadow may be gone, but the light is still shining. And in that light, we see the truth. That power isn't just about what we can do, it's about what we choose not to do. Which brings us back to the central question. What would we see if we held the ring? Would we see our best selves or our worst? Would we resist or would we fall? The answer perhaps lies in Frodo's journey. Because Frodo isn't just a hobbit, he's us. He's every one of us, facing our own tests, our own shadows. And his story isn't just about victory. It's about survival. It's about finding the strength to keep going, even when the road is dark. Because in the end, that's what matters. Not the power we wield, but the choices we make. So the next time you think about the ring, don't just think about its power. Think about its test, because the ring may be gone, but the test remains. And the question isn't whether we would pass it, it's whether we would even recognize it. The road goes ever on, but the shadows, they're always waiting. Next time, the forgotten whispers of the Barrow Downs, what lies beneath the ancient earth. But let's rewind, because before Frodo ever carried the ring, before Bilbo found it glinting in the dark, before Gollum wept over his precious in the mountains, there was a moment, a single quiet choice in the shadows of Mount Doom that changed everything. Isildur stood there, the ring still warm from Sauron's hand, the heat of a Rodruin at his back. And in that moment, why didn't he destroy it? We know what the books tell us. He claimed it as weregild for his father's death. A payment, a trophy. But think deeper. The ring had already begun its work. The moment it touched his hand, it was whispering. And Isildur heard it. Not in words, not in some grand temptation, but in the quiet, reasonable voice of his own thoughts. This is mine. I deserve this. I can use this. That's how the ring works, not with a shout, but with a murmur, not with a command, but with a suggestion so subtle it feels like your own idea. And here's the thing we never ask. What did the ring show him? Because it doesn't just offer power, it offers purpose. To Boromir, it promised the strength to save Gondor. To Galadriel, a kingdom of light under her dominion. To Samwise Gamgee, yes, even Sam, it showed a garden, endless and fertile, where he could make things grow. The ring doesn't just tempt you with what you want, it tempts you with what you love. So what did Isildur see? A restored Numenor, a world where men never fall, a king who could never be betrayed. We'll never know for certain. Tolkien never wrote that scene. But we know this. The ring didn't break Isildur. It convinced him he was right. And that's the first clue to the ring's true nature. It isn't just a thing of evil. It's a thing of narrative. It doesn't just corrupt, it rewrites. It takes the story of your life and edits it softly so you don't even notice the changes. Isildur didn't walk away from Mount Doom thinking, I'm doing evil. He walked away thinking, I'm doing justice. Which raises a chilling question. How many others fell the same way? Consider this. The ring didn't just vanish after Isildur's death. It lay hidden, but not idle. For 2,500 years it waited. And in all that time, no one found it by accident. Not the elves who wandered the Gladden fields. Not the dwarves who delved nearby. Not the men who fished its waters. The ring wasn't lost, it was choosing. It let itself be found only when the moment was right, when the bearer was right, which brings us to Deagol. We treat his story as a tragedy, a twist of fate, but think again. The ring lay in the riverbed for millennia, untouched until precisely when Smeagol and Deagol came fishing. Why then? Why them? Because the ring knew. It sensed the cracks in their friendship. The envy coiled in Smeagol's heart. It didn't just reveal itself, it arranged the scene. The moment Deagol lifted it, the ring already had its next bearer. And now the pattern emerges. The ring doesn't just wait, it orchestrates. It moves through history, not by chance but by design, finding the perfect vessel for each era. From Isildur to Smeagol, from Smeagol to Bilbo, from Bilbo to Frodo. Each handover looks accidental, but follow the thread and you'll see the loom. Take Bilbo's chance discovery in the dark. The ring abandoned Gollum. After 500 years in the deep, it let itself fall from his pocket, because it sensed a new story beginning. A hobbit alone, lost in the dark. A hobbit who would pity Gollum instead of killing him. A hobbit who, crucially, would not put the ring on at the Council of Elrond, because the ring had already planted a seed of ownership in his heart, which leads us to the most unsettling possibility. The ring was always searching for Frodo. Not by name, not by prophecy, but by design. It needed a bearer who could carry it, not wield it. Someone who could resist just enough to get it close to the fire, but not enough to throw it in. Because here's the truth. No one could willingly destroy the ring. Not Frodo, not Gandalf, not Galadriel, no one. The ring's power isn't just in making you want it, it's in making you need it. By the time you reach the cracks of doom, it has rewritten your story so completely that destroying it feels like destroying yourself. And that's why Gollum was always part of the plan. The ring knew. It couldn't be destroyed by will alone. It needed an agent of chaos, a wild card, someone outside the story it had woven. Gollum wasn't just a tragic figure, he was the ring's failsafe, a creature so consumed by obsession that he would follow it anywhere, even into the fire. The ring. Let itself be taken from him. Let Bilbo spare him. Let Frodo pity him. Because it knew, in the end, Gollum would be there. And so we come to the final question. Was the ring ever truly defeated? Oh, it was unmade. Its power was broken. But its story? That lives on. Because the ring wasn't just an object, it was an idea. The idea that power can be owned. That control can be absolute. That your desires justify your actions. And that idea didn't die in Mount Doom. We see its echoes in Saruman's fall, in Denethor's despair, even in the scouring of the Shire. The shadow lingers, not in the world, but in us. Which means the real quest wasn't about destroying the ring, it was about proving it could be done. And that's why Frodo's journey matters. Not because he succeeded, but because he tried. Not because he was strong enough to resist the ring, but because he was humble enough to know he couldn't. So the next time you think of the One Ring, don't ask who could have wielded it. Ask who could have let it go. The road goes ever on, but the shadows, they're always listening. Next time, why the Watcher in the water was waiting. What did it know that we don't? The Watcher in the water. Here was a creature Tolkien gave us almost nothing about, yet its presence lingers in the imagination. It's not just that it appears suddenly, a monstrous tentacle rising from the dark depths of the lake outside the west gate of Moria. It's that it feels intentional. This wasn't a random encounter. The Watcher wasn't just there, it was waiting. But for what? And why there? To understand this, we need to step back, way back, to the Second Age, when Moria was still Khazad-dûm, the greatest dwarven kingdom in Middle-earth. This was a time when the mountains were alive with the sounds of hammers and the glow of mithril, but it was also a time when Sauron, still in his fair guise as Anatar, was spreading his influence. The dwarves, though resistant to domination, were not immune to corruption, and somewhere in their halls, something dark took root. Picture this, deep beneath the mountain, in the hidden places where even the dwarves dared not go, there was a lake, a vast subterranean expanse of water, untouched by the light of the sun. It was here, perhaps, that Sauron planted a seed of his own design. Not a ring, not a weapon, but a guardian. A creature born of shadow and malice, bound to the water, waiting for a day that might never come. The Watcher wasn't just a monster, it was a sentinel. Its purpose? To ensure that no one entered Moria without Sauron's knowledge, or his permission. But here's where it gets interesting. By the time the Fellowship arrives, Sauron has long since been driven from Dol Guldur. His power in the region has waned. So why was the Watcher still there? Why hadn't it moved on, or simply vanished? The answer lies in the nature of Sauron's creations. They aren't just tools, they're extensions of his will. And his will doesn't fade just because he's absent. The Watcher was bound to its task not by chains or cages, but by the very essence of its being. It didn't need Sauron to be present, it only needed to wait. And wait it did, for thousands of years. Through the rise and fall of Khazad-dûm, through the awakening of Durin's Bane, through the silence of the empty halls. It waited until one fateful day, 9 travellers approached the West Gate. Did the Watcher recognise them? Did it sense the One Ring among them? The books never say, but consider this, the Watcher didn't attack immediately. It waited until they were inside the doors, until the fellowship was split, and then it struck. Not to kill, but to seal. It brought down the doors, trapping them inside. Was this a coincidence, or was it deliberate? Here's a chilling thought. What if the Watcher wasn't just guarding the entrance to Moria, it was herding the fellowship into it? What if Sauron, even in his diminished state, had foreseen this moment? He knew the ring was moving east, he knew it would pass through Moria, and he knew, as Gandalf did, that Moria was no longer a refuge, but a trap. By forcing the fellowship inside, the Watcher ensured they would face Durin's Bane, the Balrog, a creature of flame and shadow, another of Sauron's ancient allies. Which brings us to the Balrog itself, another enigma wrapped in fire. How did it survive for so long beneath the mountain? Why did it awaken when it did? And what was its connection to Sauron? The Silmarillion tells us that Balrogs were among the most fearsome servants of Morgoth, Sauron's master. They were beings of immense power, corrupted Maya who chose darkness over light. But unlike Sauron, the Balrogs were never subtle. They were weapons of destruction, not manipulation. So why was Durin's Bane lurking in the depths of Moria, dormant for centuries? Perhaps it was waiting too, waiting for a sign, a command, or a ring. The Balrog wasn't just a creature of chaos, it was a creature of purpose. And its purpose, like the Watcher's, was tied to Sauron's will. When the Fellowship entered Moria, the Balrog stirred. It didn't attack immediately, it followed them watching, waiting. Was it drawn to the ring, or was it simply responding to the intrusion? The answer lies in the confrontation with Gandalf. Their battle wasn't just a clash of powers, it was a clash of wills. Gandalf, the Mire of light and wisdom, against the Balrog, the Mire of fire and shadow. But here's the thing, Gandalf didn't defeat the Balrog, he removed it. He cast it from the bridge of Khazad-dûm, but he didn't destroy it. Instead he followed it into the depths, where they fought for days until Gandalf finally cast it down. Why did he do this? Why not destroy it where it stood? Because Gandalf knew something the Fellowship didn't. The Balrog wasn't just a threat to them, it was a threat to Middle-earth. If it had escaped Moria, it could have wreaked havoc across the land. Gandalf's sacrifice wasn't just to save the Fellowship, it was to save everyone. And yet the Balrog's presence raises another question. Why didn't Sauron use it? If he had such a powerful ally beneath the mountain, why didn't he summon it to his aid during the War of the Ring? The answer might lie in the Balrog's nature. It wasn't a servant, it was a force. And forces, once unleashed, are hard to control. Sauron, for all his power, couldn't command the Balrog as he could his orcs or his Nazgûl. The Balrog was a remnant of Morgoth's reign, a relic of a darker time. And relics, as we know, have a way of turning on those who try to wield them. So the Watcher and the Balrog, two guardians, each bound to Sauron's will, each waiting for a moment that might never come. But what does this tell us about Sauron himself? It tells us that his reach extended far beyond Mordor. His influence wasn't just in armies or fortresses, it was in the very fabric of Middle-earth. He didn't just rule, he infiltrated. And his creations weren't just tools, they were traps. Which brings us back to the Watcher. What did it know that we don't? Perhaps it knew that the Fellowship's journey wasn't just about the ring. It was about the choices they would make along the way. Every step, every decision was a test, and the Watcher was the first of many. It wasn't just guarding Moria, it was guarding the path. And in doing so, it revealed something profound about Sauron's strategy. He didn't just want to stop the Fellowship, he wanted to break them. And break them he almost did. The loss of Gandalf, the fear of the Balrog, the darkness of Moria, it all took its toll. By the time they escaped, the Fellowship was fractured, both physically and emotionally. But they pressed on, because that's what heroes do. They don't just face the darkness, they move through it. So the next time you think of the Watcher in the water, don't just see it as a monster. See it as a reminder. of the choices we make, the paths we take, and the shadows we must face, because the road goes ever on. But the Guardians, they're always watching. Next time. Why the Ents waited so long? What were they waiting for? But let's take a step back for a moment, because the Watcher in the water isn't the only Guardian in Tolkien's world that raises questions. In fact, it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that stretches across Middle-earth, from the depths of Moria to the heights of Orthanc, from the forests of Fangorn to the plains of Mordor. And at the centre of this puzzle is Sauron himself, the Dark Lord, the Deceiver, the ultimate guardian of the One Ring. But here's something that often goes unnoticed. Sauron didn't just guard the ring, he guarded knowledge. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the story of the Astari, the wizards sent to Middle-earth to oppose him. Consider this. Saruman, the White Wizard, was once the leader of the Astari, the wisest and most powerful of their order. Yet by the time of the Lord of the Rings, he had become Sauron's ally, or perhaps more accurately, his rival. How did this happen? The answer lies in Saruman's obsession with the ring. But it wasn't just the ring that consumed him. It was the knowledge of the ring. Saruman's fall began when he started to study the lore of the rings of power, delving into secrets that were meant to remain hidden. In The Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf tells Frodo that Saruman studied deeply the arts of the enemy, and in doing so, he betrayed us all. But here's the twist. Saruman didn't just betray his allies, he misunderstood his enemy. He thought he could wield the ring against Sauron, that he could master its power and turn it to his own ends. But what he failed to realize is that the ring wasn't just a tool, it was a test, and Sauron, the master manipulator, had already set the trap. Picture this. Saruman, alone in Orthanc, surrounded by his books and his scrolls, poring over ancient texts, searching for the key to unlock the ring's power. He believed that knowledge was the path to victory, that if he could only understand the ring, he could control it. But what he didn't realize is that the more he learned, the more he played into Sauron's hands. Because Sauron didn't just guard the ring, he guarded the idea of the ring. He crafted it to be irresistible, to draw in anyone who sought power, to corrupt even the wisest and most noble. And Saruman, for all his wisdom, fell right into the trap. He didn't just betray his mission, he betrayed himself. Which brings us to Gandalf. Unlike Saruman, Gandalf didn't seek to master the ring. He understood its power, its danger, its temptation, but he also understood its purpose. In The Fellowship of the Ring, he tells Frodo that the ring is altogether evil and that it must be destroyed. But here's the question. How did Gandalf come to this understanding? The books never record it, but here's what we know. Gandalf wasn't just a wise old man. He was a Maya, a being of immense power and knowledge, sent by the Valar to guide the peoples of Middle-earth. And unlike Saruman, Gandalf didn't seek knowledge for its own sake. He sought wisdom, the kind of wisdom that comes from humility, from understanding one's limits, from recognizing the darkness within oneself. This is why Gandalf was able to resist the ring's temptation. It's why he could stand before the Balrog in Moria and declare, "You cannot pass." It's why he could face Sauron's lies and manipulations and still remain true to his mission. Because Gandalf understood something that Saruman never did, that the greatest power isn't found in knowledge or strength, but in choice. And this brings us to the heart of the matter. The One Ring wasn't just a weapon, it was a test. And Sauron, the ultimate guardian, wasn't just guarding the ring, he was guarding the test. Think about it. Every step of the Fellowship's journey was a test, not just of their courage or their strength, but of their choices. From the moment Frodo took the ring, he was faced with decisions that would shape the fate of Middle-earth. Should he trust Gandalf? Should he take the ring to Rivendell? Should he bear it himself, or should he pass it on to someone else? And each choice carried consequences, not just for Frodo, but for everyone around him. The Watcher in the water tested their resolve, Moria tested their unity, Galadriel tested their hearts, and Sauron, always watching, always waiting, tested their very souls. But here's the twist. Sauron didn't just test the Fellowship, he tested himself. Because the ring wasn't just a test for its bearers, it was a test for its creator. Sauron poured so much of his own power into the ring that he became bound to it, dependent on it, vulnerable to it. And in doing so, he revealed his own weakness, his inability to understand true strength. He believed that power came from domination, from control, from fear, but he failed to see that the greatest power comes from freedom. And this is why the Fellowship succeeded where Sauron failed, because they chose to let go. Frodo chose to carry the ring, not because he wanted power, but because he wanted to save those he loved. Sam chose to follow Frodo, not because he had to, but because he believed in him. And Gandalf chose to face the Balrog, not because he knew he would win, but because he knew he had to. And this brings us back to the central question. What was Sauron guarding? Was it the ring? Was it knowledge? Or was it something deeper, something more profound? Maybe what Sauron was guarding wasn't just a piece of jewelry or a set of secrets. Maybe what he was guarding was fear itself, fear of loss, fear of weakness, fear of the unknown. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest act of heroism in The Lord of the Rings wasn't destroying the ring, it was overcoming that fear. So the next time you think about the Watcher in the water, or the Balrog, or even Sauron himself, don't just see them as guardians of the ring, see them as guardians of something much deeper, something that lies within us all, because the road goes ever on. But the tests, they're always there. Next time, why the Ents waited so long? What were they waiting for? Now let's turn our attention to the Ents, the ancient shepherds of the trees, the keepers of long memories, and the most deliberate beings in all of Middle-earth. When Merry and Pippin first encounter Treebeard, they are struck by his slow, ponderous speech, his deep-rooted wisdom, and his reluctance to act quickly. But here's the thing, the Ents weren't always this way. Once they were swift and decisive, moving through the forests with purpose. So why did they change? And more importantly, why did they wait so long to act against Saruman? The answer lies in the very heart of Fangorn Forest, and in the story of the Entwives. Picture this, long before the War of the Ring, the Ents and the Entwives lived together in harmony. The Ents tended to the forests, while the Entwives cultivated the gardens and fields. They complemented each other, their union a symbol of balance between the wild and the cultivated. But something happened, something that drove them apart. The Entwives vanished, leaving the Ents to wander the forests alone, forever searching for their lost counterparts. The books never record the exact cause of their separation, but here is what we know. The Ents became consumed by grief, their movements slowing, their voices deepening into a lament. They became creatures of memory, trapped in the past, unable to move forward. This brings us to Saruman. When Treebeard learns of the destruction Saruman has wrought upon the forests, he is filled with anger, but also hesitation. Why? Because Saruman's actions are a stark reminder of what the Ents have lost. Saruman's corruption of Isengard, once a place of beauty, mirrors the loss of the Entwives' gardens. And so the Ents hesitate. They are torn between their desire to act and their fear of losing even more. But Merry and Pippin, unlikely catalysts, provide the spark that ignites their resolve. In the end, the Ents choose to fight, not just for the forests, but for the memory of what they once had. Their march on Isengard is not just an act of revenge, it's an act of remembrance. But let's go deeper. The Ents' hesitation reveals something profound about Tolkien's world, the tension between action and inaction, between preservation and progress. The Ents are guardians of the old ways of the natural order, but they are also prisoners of their own grief. And in this they mirror the broader struggles of Middle-earth. Elves like Elrond and Galadriel grapple with the same tension. Do they stay and fight, or do they leave and preserve what they can? Even Frodo and Sam face this dilemma. Do they press on toward Mordor, or do they turn back and save themselves? The Ents' decision to act, then, is a microcosm of the larger choices made throughout the story. It's a reminder that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to take the first step. Now, let's shift our focus to Mordor itself, the dark heart of Middle-earth, the place where all roads lead and the ultimate test of the Fellowship's resolve. But here's a question that often goes unasked. What was Mordor like before Sauron? The Silmarillion gives us glimpses of its early history, but the details are sparse. We know it was a harsh land, dominated by the volcanic Mount Doom. But was it always a place of evil? The answer lies in the nature of evil itself, and in the way it corrupts not just people, but places. Picture this. Long before Sauron claimed Mordor, it was a barren land, shaped by natural forces rather than malice. It was inhospitable, yes, but not inherently evil. Sauron, however, saw its potential. He recognized that its isolation, its harshness, and its proximity to Mount Doom made it the perfect stronghold for his designs. And so he began to reshape it, building Barad-dûr, forging the One Ring, and turning Mordor into a fortress of darkness. But here's the twist. Sauron's corruption of Mordor was not just physical, it was spiritual. He imbued the land with his own malice, tainting its very essence. And in doing so, he created a place that reflected his own soul. A place of despair, of tyranny, of unrelenting darkness. This raises a deeper question. Can a land be evil? Tolkien's answer seems to be yes, but only because evil is first introduced by those who inhabit it. Mordor is not inherently evil, it is made evil by Sauron's actions. And this has profound implications for the story. Frodo's journey to Mordor is not just a physical ordeal, it's a spiritual one. He must confront not just Sauron's forces, but the very essence of the land itself. And in the end, it is his ability to resist this corruption, his ability to hold on to hope, even in the darkest of places, that allows him to succeed. But let's not forget Sam, the unsung hero of the story. While Frodo bears the ring, it is Sam who bears Frodo. And in this, he embodies a different kind of strength, the strength of loyalty, of friendship, of love. Sam's journey is a testament to the power of the ordinary, to the idea that even the smallest person can change the course of the future. And it is this idea, this belief in the inherent worth of every individual, that stands in stark contrast to Sauron's worldview. Sauron sees people as tools, as pawns, as means to an end. But Sam sees people as they are, as beings worthy of love and respect. And it is this perspective, more than anything, that allows him to endure. Now let's return to the central question. What was Sauron guarding? The answer, it seems, is not just the ring or knowledge or fear. It is his own worldview, his own understanding of power. Sauron believed that power came from domination, from control, from fear. But the Fellowship, and Sam in particular, proved him wrong. They showed that true power comes from freedom, from choice, from love. And in this they revealed the flaw in Sauron's design. He poured so much of himself into the ring that he became dependent on it, blind to the possibility that others might choose a different path. And it is this blindness, this inability to see the strength of the ordinary, that ultimately leads to his downfall. So the next time you think about Mordor or the Ents or even Sauron himself, don't just see them as obstacles to be overcome. See them as reflections of deeper truths about power, about fear, about the choices we make. Because the road goes ever on, but the tests They're always there. Next time, why the eagles didn't just fly the ring to Mordor. What were they waiting for?